Hey guys, tonight we drift into candlelit corridors and chilly stone halls, where one queen's very body became the subject of whispered gossip and scandalous exaggeration. Anne Boleyn, yes, the second wife of Henry VIII, has been described as a witch, a temptress, a reformer, and even a monster in human skin. And the first shocking fact that clings to her name is something you probably don't expect. An extra finger. That's right. Imagine standing at court in your best Tudor finery, and somebody nudges you, whispering that the Queen of England hides a sixth finger on her hand. Suddenly you realise you probably won't survive this rumour mill, because it can devour reputations as quickly as it spits out scandals. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where and when you're listening. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step closer, peering at Anne through the haze of half a millennium's gossip. Was she really born with 6 fingers? The earliest whispers said her left hand bore a tiny extra digit, almost hidden, like a pearl that had never quite formed. Her enemies seized upon this detail, spreading it as proof that she was marked by the devil, a physical deformity meant to show corruption in her soul. Picture a jealous noblewoman whispering across the banquet table. Did you see it? Did you notice her hand? Suddenly a minor quirk, or maybe no quirk at all, becomes evidence of witchcraft. Now here's a mainstream fact. No contemporary portrait of Anne shows anything other than elegant hands with long, slender fingers. She was admired for them, actually. Her hands were considered among her most alluring features. Slim, graceful, perfect for strumming the lute or gesturing in conversation. If the story were true, wouldn't at least one portraitist have been asked to disguise it? Or maybe emphasize it? That's the puzzle. Historians still argue whether the sixth finger story was invented after Anne's fall to blacken her image, or whether it referred to something much smaller. A mole, a tiny growth, or even just a nail bed that looked unusual in dim light. And then comes the quirky tidbit. Some accounts claimed Anne not only had a 6th finger, but also a strange swelling under her chin, or even mysterious marks on her body, supposedly the suckling spots of demons. That's right, a simple blemish or mole became proof that she was consorting with devils. Imagine carrying around a zit on your neck, and suddenly the entire court is whispering that you're basically running a supernatural petting zoo. Tudor rumour culture was ruthless. Still, the 6th finger rumour had legs. It outlived Anne by centuries, kept alive in pamphlets, ballads, and later Victorian novels. Those 19th century readers, who adored Gothic horror and ghost stories, were quick to imagine Anne drifting through corridors, pale and tragic, with an extra digit glinting in the moonlight like a witch's talon. It fit the Gothic vibe perfectly. The beautiful queen with a hidden deformity that marked her as unnatural. But back in the 16th century, the implications were dead serious. Physical deformities were often interpreted as moral flaws or divine punishments. A crooked spine, clearly a sign of sin. A birthmark, the devil's kiss. And so, if you walked into Henry's glittering court and whispered that the Queen had an extra finger, you weren't just pointing out a quirk, you were accusing her of being touched by evil. Now imagine the courtly setting. Great feasts blazing with candlelight, goblets clinking, ladies in shimmering silks. You glance at Anne across the table. She lifts her hand, delicate and adorned with rings. Do you see 6 fingers? Or does the power of gossip blur your sight? Maybe you glimpse a shadow, a curve of skin, and your brain fills in the blank. That's how rumour works. It reshapes perception, and the longer you stare, the less certain you become. Henry himself, of course, never seemed to notice, or if he did, he didn't care. He called Anne his obsession, his jewel, his most beloved. If she truly had an extra digit, it did nothing to dampen his passion. But her enemies, those loyal to Catherine of Aragon, those threatened by Anne's influence, were eager to magnify any imperfection. By the time Anne fell from grace, the sixth finger story had become another weapon, proof that she had always been destined for disgrace. You picture yourself listening to the whispers as Anne is led to trial. "She is no true queen," someone hisses. "She is a witch. Did you not see her hand?" The rumour becomes not just idle gossip, but evidence used to paint her as dangerous, unholy, unnatural. In a world where religion and politics were entwined, the difference between a charming eccentricity and a demonic deformity could be the difference between life and death. And here's a thought to lull you deeper. Maybe Anne herself leaned into her oddities. Maybe she used the mystery of her appearance to set herself apart. She was not blonde and fair, like most English ladies. She had dark eyes, olive skin, a striking and unusual beauty. If she did have some tiny irregularity, perhaps it made her more memorable, more magnetic. In a court of sameness, difference could become power, until it became the very excuse for destruction. So, as you imagine yourself drifting closer to Anne in her final days, you can almost feel the chill of that uncertainty. Was the sixth finger real? Was it just a wart, a mole, a trick of shadows? Or was it entirely fabricated by enemies after her death? Historians still argue, still flip through old texts and sketches, still peer at faded portraits under bright museum lights. The truth is veiled, like Anne herself beneath her hood on the scaffold, and maybe that's what keeps the story alive. Not the certainty, but the doubt. You never get to know for sure. You only hear the whispers echoing through time. A queen's hand raised in the flicker of torchlight, fingers gleaming with jewels, and somewhere, someone swears they see 6. You lean in closer, your eyes catching a glint of gold against black velvet, and suddenly another strange detail about Anne Boleyn presses itself into your mind. It's not a finger this time, but a letter. Just one single, bold letter that hung from her neck like a challenge to the entire kingdom. The famous bee necklace. You've seen it in portraits. A string of delicate pearls with a golden bee dangling at the centre, followed by 3 pear-shaped drops. It's simple, striking, and more than a little dangerous. Imagine walking into Henry's court, where fashion is more than decoration. It's a weapon. Anne wore that necklace like armour, like a brand, like a sign that said, "This is who I am. You can't ignore me." Jewellery in Tudor times wasn't just shiny decoration, it was coded language. A brooch could whisper allegiance. A gemstone could signal wealth, faith, or even magic. Pearls in particular were symbols of purity, but on Anne's neck they seemed ironic. Pearls cascading down from a letter that didn't mean blessed or beloved, but simply Boleyn. It was the mark of a woman who dared to thrust her family name, her identity, directly into the royal spotlight. And in a court obsessed with lineage, that was bold. The mainstream fact here is easy. Anne really did make that necklace famous. Portraits, particularly the ones painted after her death, consistently show her with the bee pendant. It's one of the most enduring images we have of her, a symbol that has echoed across centuries. Even in modern depictions, whether TV dramas, films or novels, you can't escape the necklace. It's practically her logo, like Nike's swoosh or Apple's bitten fruit. But here's the quirky part. The necklace didn't just carry symbolism, it carried suspicion. Some whispered that the letter B wasn't just for Boleyn, it could mean bewitched. Imagine gossiping courtiers nudging each other, smirking as they claim the Queen's jewellery spelled out her true craft. You can almost hear them at a banquet. Look there, she advertises it openly, B for black magic. Suddenly a fashionable accessory mutates into evidence of sorcery. In a paranoid age, you didn't need much for a rumour to catch fire. And then there's the debate historians still chew over. Was the necklace truly a defiant statement of Anne's power, or was it carefully cultivated propaganda after her death? Some scholars argue that the most famous portraits of Anne, the ones where she wears the necklace, were painted decades later, during her daughter Elizabeth's reign. They may have been reconstructed from memory, designed to present Anne as the mother of a glorious queen rather than as a disgraced traitor. If that's true, then maybe the necklace itself, so iconic to us now, wasn't her favourite accessory at all, but a later invention, polished up by artists to make her look instantly recognisable. Still, imagine being in the room with her. The candles flicker. She enters, head held high, pearls gleaming at her throat. That bee catches the light. It's not subtle, and that's the point. At a time when women were supposed to fade into the background, Anne carved out her identity with a single letter of gold. Even the king couldn't ignore it. Henry saw not just a woman, but a brand, an emblem that drew him in deeper and deeper. You can almost picture the scene at her coronation banquet. Anne lifts a goblet. The pearls sway. The bee glimmers like a talisman. The crowd murmurs. Some are enchanted, others bristle. A queen named for herself, not for her husband, not for her dynasty, but for her family. How dare she? It's like wearing a t-shirt that says, "Deal with it." You can see why her enemies sharpen their knives. The necklace also lives on in legend. Centuries later, people still claim to see Anne's ghost wandering the Tower of London, necklace glowing faintly against her spectral gown. Sometimes she's headless, clutching her own severed head under her arm, and the bee rests just above the collarbone that is no longer there. The jewellery outlives the body, becoming a relic of both allure and doom. And let's not forget the irony. The very emblem that once signalled pride and presence later turned into a reminder of downfall. After Anne's execution, some swore that her necklace was cursed, that whoever dared wear it would meet an unhappy end. Did it vanish with her body? Was it stolen, melted down, passed quietly among collectors? No one knows. The fate of the bee necklace remains one of those tantalising Tudor mysteries. Historians still argue whether it ended up dismantled for its pearls or tucked away in some private hoard, too dangerous to display. Now imagine you're one of the ladies in waiting ordered to prepare Anne for the scaffold. You reach to remove the necklace, your fingers brushing those cool pearls for the last time. Do you keep it as a relic, a forbidden souvenir? Or do you drop it quickly into a chest, afraid it might carry her fate with it? Either way, you know this necklace won't vanish from memory. It will hang around Anne's neck forever, painted, whispered about, haunting the centuries. So as you drift deeper into this strange story, you realise Anne Boleyn wasn't just a queen. She was an icon, a walking contradiction, a woman who used fashion as language. Her bee necklace wasn't only jewellery, it was a challenge, a dare to anyone who looked at her. See me, remember me, talk about me. And here you are, centuries later, still staring at that golden letter, still listening to the pearls clink softly in the dark. You shift your gaze from that glittering necklace to a younger Anne, long before she ever set foot on the English throne. Picture her as a teenager, shipped off across the Channel, not yet a queen, but already absorbing the elegance and sharp edges of another world. France. The court of Francis I, with its Renaissance sparkle, its polished manners, and its dangerous undercurrents of intrigue. This is where Anne Boleyn learned to be Anne Boleyn, the Anne who would one day captivate a king and terrify a kingdom. The mainstream fact here is this. Anne spent 7 years in continental courts, serving first Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, then Queen Claude of France. 7 years is a long time for a Tudor girl, especially when you consider that most noble daughters were expected to stay closer to home. In France, Anne learned not only the French language but also French style, music, poetry, conversation, and most importantly the art of charm. You can imagine her strolling the polished galleries of Amboise, watching courtiers bow and laugh with just the right balance of wit and deference. She noticed the way women dressed, lighter fabrics, brighter colours, daring cuts compared to England's heavy gowns. She absorbed it all like a sponge, and when she eventually returned home she must have seemed like a creature from another world. Dark-eyed, sharp-tongued, with a smile edged in mystery. And here comes the quirky tidbit. Some whispers claimed Anne's French education gave her not just refinement, but also scandal. Francis I was notorious for his bawdy court, and his jokes about ladies often made their way back to England. Some claimed Anne picked up habits and knowledge unsuitable for a modest English lady. One rumour even suggested that Francis himself bragged about knowing her in ways a king shouldn't. Was it true? Almost certainly not, but the rumour stuck, and back in England it fed into her reputation as dangerously cosmopolitan, too French, too exotic, too clever for her own good. Historians still argue whether her time abroad polished her into a perfect courtier, or whether it gave her a veneer of foreignness that made her stand out a little too much. Was she truly a sophisticated European lady, fluent in the arts of flirtation and dance? Or was she simply an ambitious girl who happened to come home with better manners and a sharper wardrobe than the rest? You can imagine yourself walking into Henry VIII's court in the late 1520s. Most ladies wear heavy English gowns, embroidered and stiff. Then Anne sweeps in, her French hood tilted just so, her sleeves cut in a style the others haven't dared try. People glance at her, whisper behind their hands. Some admire, others bristle. She doesn't look like them, doesn't sound like them, and that difference makes her magnetic. You can't look away. It wasn't just clothing, though. Anne learned conversation as an art form in France. There women could hold their own in intellectual salons, discuss poetry, philosophy and politics. She brought that back with her, wielding it like a dagger hidden in a bouquet. While most English ladies blushed and giggled, Anne could trade barbs and verses. She could make Henry laugh, challenge him, draw him in. Imagine being a king used to nodding courtiers, then meeting a woman who teases you with French wordplay. It's no wonder he was hooked, but of course the darker spin never left her. French sophistication could quickly turn into suspicion of witchcraft. A woman too polished, too witty, too different. Was she even natural? Some claimed her exotic aura, with her olive-toned skin and striking black eyes, made her look almost Spanish, almost Italian, not properly English. Combined with those rumours from France, the picture painted was clear. Anne wasn't a safe choice. She was dangerous. And think about it. You can still see the fingerprints of her French years in the choices she made later as queen. Her preference for French-style hoods instead of English gabled ones. Her taste for dark satin gowns rather than bright brocades. Even her famous motto, the most happy, had that Renaissance flair for dramatic simplicity. Everything about her was shaped by those years abroad, as though France had dipped her in a new light and sent her back shining just a little too brightly. You picture her returning to England at around 20, no longer a child, no longer a background player. She speaks French as smoothly as English. She has courtly poise. She knows how to tilt her head just so, how to pause before replying, how to let her eyes linger a second too long. By the time she meets Henry, she's not a blank slate. She's already a finished puzzle, edges sharpened abroad, and that's the haunting irony. What made Anne irresistible was also what made her suspect. The foreign airs, the sophistication, the sly smile. It drew Henry in, but it gave her enemies fuel. "She's not one of us," they whispered. "She's too French, too strange." You can almost hear the muttering in the corners of the palace, convinced she brought back not just perfumes and poetry, but also curses and foreign magic. So tonight, as you drift deeper into this story, you see Anne standing between two worlds. On one side, the heavy, traditional, stiff-laced English court. On the other, the vibrant, dangerous sparkle of France. And she belongs to both, and neither. That tension, that duality, is what made her unforgettable, and what would eventually make her a target. When you close your eyes, you still see her walking across the gallery, dark gown swishing, French hood tilted, every step rehearsed yet effortless. The English courtiers stop their chatter and watch, some in awe, some in jealousy, some in suspicion, but no one looks away. That was the power Anne carried back from France, the kind of power that whispers of destiny and doom all at once. You shuffle forward, feeling the polished boards of the Tudor gallery beneath your feet, as if your own shoes echo in time with a phantom memory. The hall is dim, but not empty, never empty, because in your mind's eye you see her again. Anne. She doesn't need trumpets or a fanfare. She doesn't even need to speak. She arrives in silence, and yet every pair of eyes snaps toward her as if pulled by invisible strings. Why? Because of what she's wearing. Not gold, not crimson, not sapphire or emerald. She has chosen black. Black satin that seems to drink up the candlelight rather than scatter it. Black that makes her pale skin almost luminescent. Black that says, "I am different, and you will not look away." At a court where clothing screams louder than sermons, Anne's wardrobe becomes her first line of power. The mainstream historical fact is easy enough. Anne Boleyn was a fashion innovator. She imported French hoods, softer fabrics, and daring silhouettes into the English court. While other women balanced heavy, stiff gable hoods on their heads like miniature rooftops, Anne's French hood revealed more of the hairline, framed the face, and suggested something both elegant and intimate. When she wore black, it wasn't to mourn. It was to declare that her style belonged to no one but herself. Fashion historians still say she single-handedly shifted Tudor dress toward the continental trend, but here's the quirky tidbit. Her love of black satin and dark hues sparked whispers that she was trying to disguise things. People claim she used the darkness of her gowns to hide strange blemishes on her body. Maybe those little moles that enemies later called the devil's marks. Maybe some secret flaw she didn't want revealed. Others joked, half seriously, that she dressed like a widow to prepare Henry for the day she'd bury his first wife. Picture the snickering courtiers, passing goblets of wine, muttering that Mistress Boleyn looked ready for a funeral in the middle of a wedding masque. It wasn't just gossip, it was performance art disguised as fashion critique. Now, historians still argue whether this preference for black was simply continental taste, absorbed during her years in France, or whether it was something deliberate, a cultivated image to set her apart from Catherine of Aragon and every other lady vying for attention. After all, in a sea of crimson brocades and jewel-stitched gowns, the woman in sleek black satin becomes a magnet. Was it instinct or calculation? No one can prove it, but the debate lingers in every book and biography. You can almost imagine a scene. The court holds a masque in the great hall. Musicians play lutes and sackbuts. The fire pops in the hearth. Ladies sweep by in gowns glittering with cloth of gold. Then Anne steps in, her gown a stark black, her pearls glowing like tiny moons against the darkness. The dancers pause. Even Henry, halfway through a conversation with one of his lords, stops mid-sentence. She hasn't said a word, but she has silenced the room. That is the power of deliberate contrast. Of course, not everyone appreciated the effect. Black had ominous connotations. In a world where colours broadcast rank and fortune, black whispered of mourning, of endings, of solemn things. Wearing it at court banquets or dances was unsettling, even scandalous. To some, Anne's fashion choices hinted at arrogance. To others they smacked of sorcery. A few whispered that she wore black because she was already cloaking herself in the shadows of doom. But the irony is that Anne's dark elegance made her the most unforgettable woman of her age. Artists paint her that way even now. Pearls at her throat, black hood crowning her head, eyes smouldering from the shadows of centuries. While Catherine of Aragon, Jane Seymour, and countless other Tudor ladies are remembered in the predictable palette of reds and golds, Anne endures as something sharper, more modern. She almost looks like she could walk into a 21st century cocktail party and still make jaws drop. You think back to how calculated the court could be. Every jewel, every ribbon, every sleeve conveyed allegiance, wealth, or ambition. Clothing wasn't just fashion. It was politics stitched in silk. Anne mastered this silent language. Even her French hood carried a message. She was continental, cosmopolitan, unlike the insular English ladies who clung to older styles. She wasn't here to blend in. She was here to dominate. The thought sends a shiver down your neck. Imagine gliding along that gallery again. Her perfume lingers, faint and spicy, and the hush of her satin hem grazes the floor. You glance sideways and see courtiers whispering as she passes, half admiring, half condemning. There goes the mistress. There goes the enchantress. There goes the storm in black satin. And then you realise something chilling. Whether she chose the gowns out of personal taste or strategic brilliance, she stitched herself into legend. Every historian, every novelist, every filmmaker remembers Anne Boleyn first as the darkly dressed queen, the midnight flame who dazzled Henry and scorched herself in the process. The colour black, once whispered about with suspicion, became the visual shorthand for her entire story. So when you drift off tonight and picture her, don't see her in ruby velvet or emerald brocade. See her as she chose to be seen, satin like still water at midnight, pearls like stars caught on her skin, eyes fixed on a crown she could almost touch. You walk beside her, heart pounding, realizing her wardrobe was never just fabric. It was prophecy stitched in silk. It was a silent warning. It was Anne saying, I will not fade into the background. I will blaze, even in shadow. And though centuries pass, the vision lingers. You still see her, half light, half shadow, black satin whispering secrets that the Tudor court was too afraid to say aloud. You drift forward again, and the hum of the Tudor court quiets into something more private, more perilous. The black satin from before still rustles in your imagination. But now it is not the fabric that captures attention. It is her neck. You notice it only when she tilts her chin just so, when the candlelight catches a curve where it doesn't quite belong. Anne, the woman who redefined beauty standards at Henry's court, was whispered to have carried a tiny mole, a small swelling, or perhaps even a wart on her neck. It sounds like nothing, a trivial imperfection. But in the 16th century, where superstition clung to every shadow, such details could be magnified into portents of witchcraft. The mainstream historical fact here is straightforward. Anne's contemporaries and later chroniclers recorded that she bore certain small moles upon her person. That's it. But when you are rising toward a crown, even the smallest blemish can become ammunition for enemies. And here's the quirky tidbit. Gossip said she tried to hide the mark with jewelled necklaces, high collars, or even the dramatic black ribbons you see in some later portraits. Imagine her fastening a choker of velvet or pearls before entering the hall, not simply for fashion, but as a quiet act of self-defence. You might even picture her chuckling at the thought, if they stare, let them stare at the diamonds. Still, no one can prove exactly what the mark was, or even whether it existed at all. Historians still argue whether these so-called imperfections were real physical features, exaggerated blemishes, or malicious inventions created after her fall. Was Anne's neck truly marked in a way people noticed, or did hostile chroniclers, those gleeful to see her dead, sprinkle their accounts with ugly details to make her sound less human, more monstrous? The debate lingers, and you're left wandering in the murk between rumour and truth. Think for a moment about the Tudor world. A beauty mark today might be admired, even envied, but in Anne's time, a mole could be branded as a witch's teat, a tiny portal for the devil's kiss. Imagine the court's whispers spreading like wildfire. Did you see it? That shadow on her neck? The air itself would tighten with suspicion. Courtiers, eager to tear her down, would treat the mark as proof of unholy influence. After all, wasn't she the woman who bewitched Henry into abandoning a queen of 20 years? Wasn't she the temptress who bent church and state to her will? One dark spot on her skin became a cosmic metaphor. Corruption disguised as beauty. Yet you can't help but laugh a little at how ridiculous it sounds. Here was Anne, dazzling and sharp, commanding attention with her wit and charm, and someone decides that a mole on her neck is the real reason for her rise. As if Henry, proud, stubborn Henry, would risk the wrath of the Pope because of a freckle. It's absurd, and yet that absurdity carried lethal weight. Remember, this is the same world where comets foretold disasters, where an extra fingernail hinted at demonic ties, where even dreams were catalogued like weather patterns predicting fate. Of course they would turn a blemish into destiny. You walk a little closer in your imagination. Anne is laughing at something, a sly remark, a courtier's blunder. The pearls at her throat shift, and for an instant you see it. A dark pinprick just under the jawline. Ordinary, really. So ordinary you'd likely forget it within seconds. But not here. Not in Henry's court. In this world it becomes a symbol of sin, a banner of suspicion, a sign that beauty itself might be a mask covering rot. And the strangest part? Anne seemed to play along. She never shied from adornments that drew the eye to her neck. She wore necklaces heavy with gems, pendants dangling in provocative shapes. If she was hiding something, she did it in a way that only made people look harder. It was as if she was daring them. Yes, stare if you must. What you see is mine to control. The tension builds as you imagine the quiet paranoia. Did Henry ever notice it? Did he trace it with a fingertip during one of their private moments? Did it bother him, or did it only make her more real, more human, more irresistible? No one can say. Historians still argue whether Henry later mentioned it in anger, or whether it was nothing more than the invention of his counsellors eager to blacken her name. The record is slippery, shifting like candlelight across polished wood, and so you are left with the strangeness of it all, that a queen's fate, a kingdom's rupture, a dynasty's future, could be tangled up with the smallest of details, a mark on a neck, barely visible, half remembered, maybe not even there. You almost want to whisper a warning to her as she passes. Cover it better, Anne, or leave it bare and let them choke on their own suspicions. But she wouldn't listen, would she? Anne never lived cautiously. She lived like her gowns, stark, daring, unforgettable. If there was a blemish on her neck, she turned it into a weapon. If there was none, she let the rumours swirl, knowing that mystery could be as potent as beauty. And so she walks past you again, ribbons fluttering, pearls catching the light, a smile curved with secrets. The room buzzes with whispers, but she does not slow her stride. And you, caught between fascination and unease, realise the truth. In the Tudor court, perfection was impossible, but the illusion of perfection was deadly. Anne balanced on that razor's edge, neck bare to the whispers, daring the world to decide whether her beauty was divine or dangerous. You follow her through the candlelit corridors of memory again, and this time it's not the pearls on her neck or the sly quirk of her smile that keeps you hooked. It's the sound of her voice. You lean in, because Anne Boleyn didn't just have clever words, she had a delivery, a cadence, an accent that rolled off her tongue in a way utterly alien to most of Henry's court. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Anne was raised for much of her youth not in England, but in the glittering courts of the Netherlands and France. That means by the time she returned to Henry's orbit, she wasn't just some country noble's daughter with basic manners. She had absorbed continental refinement like a sponge. Think French grace, Flemish poise, and a flair for languages that could make a conversation sparkle. But here comes the quirky tidbit. Her accent, shaped by those years abroad, was said to sound strange to English ears. Imagine the whispers at court. She speaks like a Frenchwoman. To some, it was dazzling, a mark of sophistication. To others, it made her seem foreign, unsettling, a woman not entirely of their world. You can picture her standing in the great hall, dropping a sharp remark in a voice that tilted and curved in ways her rivals couldn't imitate. Some must have leaned closer just to catch the rhythm, while others scowled, thinking her tones too sharp, too haughty, too other. Historians still argue whether her voice was charming or grating, whether it enchanted Henry from the first or annoyed him even as he adored her. Was it light and lilting, like music, or was it nasal and sharp, the kind of voice that cuts into conversation like a dagger through fabric? The accounts are maddeningly contradictory. One man's bewitching is another man's shrill, and centuries later you're left with little more than echoes. But let yourself imagine the scene. The English courtiers are used to women who speak softly, deferentially, like background harp music. Then Anne arrives, her vowels tinged with French, her consonants crisp, her phrases bold. She doesn't giggle behind her hand. She bites into a sentence like it's an apple. You stand in the back of the chamber, and you feel the ripple of unease as men blink, as ladies exchange glances. She's not blending in, not trying to sound like anyone else. She's foreign in her own homeland, and she wields that foreignness like a sword. And the impact. Imagine Henry. Here was a king surrounded daily by flatterers who droned predictable lines, by women who spoke only when invited. And suddenly, this, a voice that challenged him, teased him, delighted him, irritated him, all at once. No wonder he fell headlong. It wasn't just her face or her figure, it was that sound, that rhythm, reminding him that not everything in his court belonged to him already. Something in Anne was untamed. There's an irony too. Anne's critics later painted her as a schemer, a manipulator, a woman who tricked the king. But if her voice was truly as distinctive as they said, she couldn't have hidden it even if she wanted to. She walked into every room branded by her difference. Every word she spoke set her apart, and she leaned into it rather than pulling away. Imagine the confidence required to open your mouth in a hostile court and let them hear you're not like them at all. Some accounts say she could sing beautifully, her foreign-tinged English softening into melody. Others claim her speaking voice grated, as if every word she uttered came dipped in vinegar. The truth likely lay in between, shifting depending on who was listening and what they already thought of her. To her friends, her voice was wit and warmth. To her enemies, it was arrogance given sound. And you can almost hear it now, can't you? You're in the great hall, firelight flickering, goblets clinking. Anne leans toward Henry, her voice low but quick, words spiced with French inflection. He throws back his head and laughs, delighted. Around them, courtiers pretend not to stare, though every ear strains to catch her strange tones. Some smirk, some frown, and one or two mutter beneath their breath. She sounds like a witch. 'Cause in this court anything unusual could be twisted into the supernatural. You have to chuckle at the absurdity. A woman's accent, something as ordinary as the way her tongue shapes vowels, becoming a political weapon. But in the Tudor world, that's exactly what it was. If she sounded foreign, then she could be cast as foreign influence, untrustworthy, un-English, dangerous. It wasn't just her words that mattered. It was how they landed in the air. The whispers grew louder when Anne argued, when she raised her voice, when she cut across a man mid-sentence. A shrill witch, some muttered. A clever temptress, said others. Henry predictably adored it, at least for a time. He was a man who loved music, theatre, words. To him, Anne's voice must have been like a new instrument, a fresh song in a tired playlist. No wonder he replayed it again and again until it became the soundtrack to his obsession. And so you realise something. Anne Boleyn didn't just rise because she was beautiful or clever. She rose because she sounded different. In a world where sameness was safety, she chose, or perhaps simply couldn't help, being unmistakable. Every syllable marked her as extraordinary for better or worse. You imagine yourself leaning closer as she speaks now, hearing that lilt, that strange blend of France and England, sharpness and music. It carries you forward like a tide, and you can't escape the thought that perhaps this, her voice, her foreignness, her refusal to soften her sound, was both her greatest allure and her deepest curse. You lean deeper into the candlelit haze, and now your ears strain for whispers of something else, something more peculiar than her accent or her wit. Because people didn't just talk about Anne Boleyn's fashion or her smile, they talked about her body, or more specifically a strange bump upon it. Here's the mainstream fact. Anne Boleyn was accused at her downfall of having a wen, an unsightly growth or swelling, somewhere on her neck. The official records from her trial mention nothing of it directly, but later gossip and hostile reports insisted that such a mark existed, proof that nature itself had cursed her. To Tudor eyes, a blemish wasn't merely a blemish. It could be a sign from God, a symbol of hidden corruption. But here's the quirky tidbit. Some claimed Anne hid the bump beneath elaborate high collars and jewelled necklaces. Imagine her gliding into court, pearls wound tightly around her throat, not just as fashion, but as armour, carefully arranged to conceal that little swelling. Think of the ritual each morning. Servants helping her dress, adjusting fabrics, draping chains, all to make sure no curious eyes glimpsed what lay beneath. In a way, her jewellery became not just decoration, but camouflage. Historians still argue whether the infamous swelling ever existed. Was it real, a small cyst or goiter blown out of proportion by enemies eager to slander her? Or was it entirely fabricated, a weapon of rumour forged to stain her reputation? There are no surviving portraits showing any hint of such a mark, though of course artists were paid to flatter, not to expose flaws. The debate drifts endlessly, like smoke that never clears. You picture yourself in that crowded court where every detail was magnified. The rich velvet gowns, the glint of gold thread, the glitter of rubies. But what about the shadows beneath those adornments? Did anyone ever catch a fleeting glimpse of a lump beneath her necklace? A ripple of flesh disguised as elegance? Or was it all projection? Whispers fueled by jealousy and fear? Pause here and consider the psychology. In Tudor England, a woman's body wasn't her own. Every mole, every freckle, every crooked tooth became subject to interpretation, a canvas onto which society painted meaning. Anne's supposed swelling turned her from a dazzling queen into a figure of suspicion. To some, it was proof of witchcraft. To others, evidence of her unfitness to be queen. In a time obsessed with omens, even the smallest bump became a cosmic sign. You smile at the irony. Today, a dermatologist would shrug at a little growth, maybe offer a quick outpatient removal. But in Henry's world, medicine was superstition, and superstition was politics. A lump on the neck. Proof of corruption in the soul. It's almost comical, except for the fact that it helped doom a living woman. And think about Henry himself. Imagine the king, in his private chambers, brushing his fingers along Anne's neck. Did he ever feel it? Did he ever notice the swelling that others claimed existed? If he did, perhaps he dismissed it, at least while love still burned. But once affection curdled into obsession and resentment, every remembered imperfection could be twisted into evidence against her. Love makes you blind, they say, but in Henry's case, hatred made him magnify. You shift closer, and the scene becomes vivid. Anne stands before her ladies-in-waiting, a mirror before her, the pearls carefully clasped, the fabric smoothed just so. They murmur softly, ensuring nothing shows. She tilts her head, checking, adjusting, aware that the court's gaze is merciless. For a queen, vanity isn't just vanity, it's survival. Now imagine the court gossip swirling like smoke. A lady whispers to another, "Did you see it? Just there, near her collarbone?" The other shakes her head, wide-eyed. Whether they saw anything at all hardly matters. The suggestion alone grows legs. Within hours, the rumour gallops through the palace. The queen hides a blemish. The queen's beauty is false. The queen is marked. By the time it reaches her enemies, the swelling is no longer a small bump. It's a monstrous deformity, practically a devil's teat. And here's where the story tilts into the surreal. Some hostile sources claimed Anne had not just a swelling on her neck, but also an extra breast. Yes, really. In the fertile imagination of her enemies, she became a kind of mutant, her body evidence of unnaturalness. You shake your head. half amused, half horrified. Only in Tudor politics could an extra breast become grounds for executing a queen, but that was the danger of standing out in Henry's world. If you were exceptional, if you shone too brightly, any detail, real or invented, could be twisted into proof of corruption. Anne's enemies couldn't beat her in wit, in charm, in intellect, so they attacked her body instead. You can almost hear the snide laughter echoing in dark corners of the court, the muttered jokes about pearls covering more than jewels, about the queen hiding her nature behind ribbons, and you wonder, how must it have felt living with that constant scrutiny, knowing that even a patch of skin could be your undoing? The truth will never be known. Perhaps Anne had nothing more than flawless skin, and the swelling was pure invention. Perhaps she did have a small growth, something trivial in modern eyes but catastrophic in her own time. What matters is not the reality, but the way perception shaped her fate. So you linger on the image. Anne, draped in finery, her head held high, her throat adorned with ropes of jewels. Beneath the glitter, maybe nothing at all, or maybe a tiny bump, a little secret she carried like a stone in her shoe. Either way, it became part of her legend. One more twist in the story of a queen whose very body was transformed into a battleground. You lean further forward into the hush, because the gossip about Anne's body didn't stop at her neck. The Tudor court loved nothing better than to turn private quirks into public condemnation, and when they ran out of lumps and freckles to talk about, they turned to her blood. That's right. Your veins. Her veins. Everybody's veins were the obsession of the day, because a queen's greatest duty was simple: bear a healthy son, and Anne Boleyn's blood, some swore, carried a curse. Here's the mainstream fact. Anne gave birth to one surviving child, the future Queen Elizabeth the Fair, but she also suffered miscarriages, most notoriously in 1536, when she reportedly lost a male fetus. For Henry, who had already twisted his kingdom inside out to marry her, this was a devastating blow. The promise of a male heir had driven him to break from Rome, cast aside Catherine of Aragon, and crown Anne in her place. Every pregnancy was not just personal, it was political. Now, the quirky tidbit. Centuries later, modern scholars and even medical researchers began to wonder whether Anne may have been rhesus negative, an uncommon blood type that, when matched with a rhesus positive partner like Henry, could cause repeated miscarriages after the first pregnancy. You picture the Tudor physicians armed with leeches and prayers, staring blankly while Anne endured loss after loss. They had no understanding of antibodies, no concept of RA incompatibility. To them, a miscarriage wasn't biology. It was a sign of sin, punishment, or maybe even witchcraft. Historians still argue whether this theory of Rh incompatibility holds water. Some point out that the records are too sparse, that there's no way to confirm blood types from 500 years ago. Others think the pattern of Anne's pregnancies fits uncannily well. One live child followed by multiple miscarriages. The debate continues, a kind of ghostly medical mystery written across centuries. Imagine being Anne in that moment. You cradle your belly, feeling the flutter of life, carrying the weight of a nation's expectations. Each time the court whispers swell like tides. Is it a boy? Will it live? Every glance is loaded. Every smile from Henry is edged with calculation. And then, when the worst happens, the whispers grow cruel. You failed. Again. You can almost hear the hissing, soft as candle smoke seeping through the corridors. And here's where the tension sharpens. In Tudor culture, miscarriage wasn't something a woman could grieve privately. It was political failure, often attributed to moral weakness. Anne wasn't just losing pregnancies, she was losing ground, losing love, losing the very legitimacy that had crowned her. Her body became a battlefield she couldn't control. You pause to picture the scene after that fateful miscarriage in January 1536. Some reports say Anne delivered a deformed fetus. Others deny this, insisting the child was perfectly formed, only stillborn. Henry, already drifting toward frustration and suspicion, reportedly muttered that he had been seduced into this cursed marriage by witchcraft. You shiver at the thought of hearing that from your own husband, your king, the man for whom you'd risked everything. The irony, of course, is glaring. Henry himself fathered children who died in infancy, both before and after Anne. His own genetic health may have been questionable, with modern speculation ranging from diabetes to MacLeod syndrome. But in the 16th century, blame almost always fell squarely on the woman. A sickly child, her fault. A stillbirth, her curse. The king could never be flawed, only the queen, and yet, out of this cruel cycle came one of history's most powerful rulers. Anne's failure to give Henry a son meant she gave him Elizabeth instead. You smirk at the cosmic twist. The girl he dismissed as useless would one day preside over England's golden age. If there's ever been a historical take that, it's this one. But you can't ignore the human cost. Picture Anne's chamber after the miscarriage, the muffled sobs, the heavy scent of herbs, the silence where the cries of a newborn should have been. Her ladies-in-waiting moving softly, tucking her back into the pillows, murmuring useless comforts. Outside, men plot, rivals whisper, and already her enemies sharpen their knives. Her body has betrayed her, and in doing so, it has given them their opening. The debate about her blood continues to fascinate modern minds. Was it RH incompatibility? Was it something else? Endometriosis, thyroid problems, or sheer bad luck? You almost laugh at the futility of the guessing. It's like trying to diagnose a stranger from 5 centuries away based on gossip. Yet the mystery lingers, irresistible, as though her blood still pulses beneath the page, daring you to solve it. And then, with a wry grin, you think, maybe it's better unsolved. Maybe the uncertainty is part of her spell, the thing that keeps you up tonight. After all, if we knew for sure, if science tidily explained it away, it would be just another sad medical file. Instead, Anne's story remains half medicine, half myth, suspended in that strange twilight where history lives. Still, you circle back to that single word, blood. In her world, blood wasn't just biology, it was destiny. Noble blood, tainted blood, cursed blood. It defined marriages, wars, thrones. For Anne, it defined her rise and her fall. Whether cursed by antibodies or cursed by politics, her blood carried both a queen and a death sentence. You sink into the thought, letting it settle. Somewhere between the pearls around her neck and the veins beneath her skin, Anne Boleyn bore the weight of history. And as the candle burns lower, you realise she still does. You're lying back, trying to relax, when the strange thought creeps in. What if every flicker of candlelight, every shadow in a corner, every weird dream you had meant something terrifying about your future? That was Anne Boleyn's world. She wasn't just juggling Henry's mood swings and a kingdom's suspicion. She was also living inside a culture that saw signs, prophecies, and omens everywhere, as if the universe itself couldn't stop gossiping about her fate. The firm fact you need to hold on to is this. 16th century England was a hotbed of prophecy. Henry VIII himself commissioned astrologers to calculate the likelihood of a male heir. and courtiers whispered about the meaning of eclipses, comets, and earthquakes. These weren't fringe beliefs. They were central to the way politics worked. You couldn't escape them any more than you could escape the smell of damp straw on a rainy London street. Now the quirky bit. There's a story that Anne once dreamed her head was sliced clean off and went rolling like a ball across the floor. If true, it was the sort of dream that would make you choke on your morning porridge. Dreams weren't harmless private moments. They were treated like divine telegrams. Imagine Anne waking in a cold chamber, listening to the wind scrape against the shutters, wondering if that dream was a warning she couldn't outrun. It's the kind of thing you dismiss today with a "well, that's unsettling," and then scroll TikTok for cat videos. But in Tudor times, the dream could circulate like wildfire and stick to your reputation forever. Historians still argue whether Anne herself believed in these omens, or whether the stories were manufactured after her death to paint her as doomed from the start. Some scholars say she was a sharp political animal, not a mystic dreamer. Others insist that, like everyone else of her age, she would have been saturated with the fears of cosmic signs and prophecies. After all, she couldn't avoid living in a world where Henry himself quizzed astrologers before making personal decisions. Picture the scene in 1533, the year of her coronation. A comet blazed across the sky. To us, it's just a lump of rock and ice streaking past the sun. To her contemporaries, it was an announcement from heaven. People muttered in taverns that it foretold disaster. Add to this a freakish calf born with deformities in Suffolk, which was quickly dubbed proof that Anne's marriage was monstrous. Imagine being so unpopular that even farm animals are recruited as part of the smear campaign against you. And here's a modern-style joke for you. If Anne were alive today, every time Mercury went retrograde, she'd probably groan, "Great, another charge of witchcraft incoming." But the superstition wasn't funny to her. Each sign became political ammunition. A thunderstorm during her coronation was said to show God's displeasure. A miscarriage in her chamber became proof of her cursed womb. Even small accidents could snowball into evidence that her marriage to Henry was unnatural. The Tudor court didn't just gossip about scandals, they treated gossip as if it had been notarized by heaven. And here's where the scholarly debate deepens. Was the infamous tale of her final miscarriage in 1536 deliberately exaggerated? Some records claim the fetus was malformed, monstrous, as if her body itself was rebelling against the throne. Other accounts describe the fetus as perfectly normal, with the monstrous label pasted on later by her enemies. Historians still argue whether this was genuine medical tragedy or carefully crafted propaganda. The truth may be lost, but the damage to Anne's reputation was permanent. Think about the atmosphere. Candle smoke curling in the great halls, whispers bouncing off the stone walls, and Anne sitting on her throne knowing that at any moment a bad harvest, a freak storm, or even a sneeze at the wrong time could be interpreted as divine judgment. It's almost like living under constant surveillance, but instead of cameras, it's the sky, the weather, the animals, and your own body betraying you. Another odd detail. Charms and fortune-telling weren't only for commoners. Aristocratic ladies sometimes carried talismans to ward off bad luck. Some courtiers secretly consulted wise women who read palms or used scrying bowls. You can picture Anne, surrounded by glittering gowns and jewelled headdresses, yet maybe slipping a protective token into her sleeve before attending court. Was it out of belief, or just better safe than sorry? We'll never know. What's clear is that the idea of destiny shaped how people saw her. From the moment Catherine of Aragon was cast aside, people murmured that Anne's rise could only end in blood. Every lightning strike, every eerie dream seemed to confirm it. And yet, If fate had truly condemned her, how do you explain Elizabeth Thembury, her daughter, becoming one of England's most legendary monarchs? That contradiction gnaws at you in the dark, doesn't it? Was the universe really against Anne, or was it just human jealousy dressed up in cosmic language? Here's joke number 2. Imagine if Anne had access to Google. She'd type in "dream of losing head meaning," and WebMD would probably respond, "You may be stressed." Anne would sigh. Thanks, that really clears it up. But jokes aside, you can't miss the psychological toll. Every time she stumbled, every time Henry looked disappointed, the weight of prophecy pressed down heavier. Did she ever lie awake, staring at the canopy above her bed, wondering if her enemies were right, that her crown was already cursed? Did she feel doomed, or did she steel herself with the same stubborn defiance that made her stand tall even at the scaffold? The final strange twist is this. Despite the supposed omens of doom, Anne carefully cultivated her own symbols. Her personal badge was a crowned white falcon standing on roses, a carefully chosen emblem of legitimacy and grace. She knew the power of imagery. She wielded it like a weapon, projecting an aura of destiny, even as others painted her as cursed. It's almost as if she was trying to write her own prophecy, one where she was queen not by accident, but by divine right. And yet, like all stories soaked in superstition, hers ended in a storm of irony. The very culture that let her shine with carefully chosen symbols also destroyed her with twisted ones. You sigh softly, realizing that in a world where everything is a sign, the meaning can always be spun against you. Final joke for this section, whispered like a bedtime aside. You know Anne would have rolled her eyes at all this. If someone pointed out a bad omen, she might have snapped, "If heaven's really against me, it should send a clearer memo." But history shows heaven never sends clear memos. Only people, eager to read signs into shadows, do. And for Anne Boleyn, that relentless reading of omens created a narrative she could never fully escape, no matter how sharp her mind or dazzling her charm. You close your eyes for a moment, almost expecting silence, but instead your ears fill with the chatter of centuries. You're not in your room anymore. You're standing in the echoing vaults of Tudor England, where walls remember every whispered rumour and footsteps of courtiers still shuffle in the dust. The strange thing is, you realise that Anne Boleyn herself lived in a world where noise never stopped. Even behind closed doors, whispers of prophecy, scandal and gossip rattled around like loose coins in a pocket. And the thing about noise is, it sticks. Long after the person is gone, the sound keeps bouncing. The firm historical fact here is straightforward. Anne Boleyn's reputation was tarnished in her lifetime, then twisted endlessly after her death. Chroniclers, pamphleteers, and ballad singers spread stories about her, some laudatory, many scandalous. She was accused of witchcraft, of seducing Henry with dark charms, of carrying 6 fingers and strange moles. These were not private murmurs, they were public narratives that gave shape to her downfall. The way her story was told became as deadly as the charges themselves. Now, for the quirky detail. Decades after her execution, travellers to the Tower of London claim they could hear ghostly laughter at night, said to be Anne herself mocking the men who condemned her. Others swore they saw her headless figure drifting near the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Whether true or just a Victorian flourish, it's telling that Anne's voice, literally or metaphorically, was imagined to echo long past her death. Even in spectral form she wouldn't be silent, and here's where scholars still debate fiercely. Did Anne's enemies deliberately craft the witchcraft and sorcery rumours before her fall? Or were they later inventions layered on by later propagandists and dramatists? Some insist that in 1536, the sixth finger myth already circulated in court circles. Others argue there's zero contemporary evidence for it, and that the deformity story was born centuries later to satisfy audiences hungry for melodrama. The uncertainty itself becomes part of the echo chamber. A story repeated so often it feels true, even when its origins are slippery. Imagine the noise inside the Tudor court, the clinking of goblets at banquets, the rustle of silk gowns in corridors, and underneath it all the hiss of gossip. Did you hear what the Queen dreamed last night? They say the comet's against her. I saw her drop a ring. Must be bad luck. Each whisper was harmless alone, but together they created a storm that battered her reputation. You can almost hear it, like being trapped in a room where a dozen people are murmuring just beyond the edge of comprehension. Joke break. If Anne had lived today, she wouldn't have been destroyed by whispering courtiers. She'd have been destroyed by Twitter threads. Six Finger Gate would trend worldwide before she even finished breakfast. But beneath the jokes is a darker truth. Anne's voice was drowned out by the noise of others. She wrote letters, she made speeches, she stood tall on the scaffold with calm dignity. But those words were often overwritten by hostile narratives. In the Tudor world, controlling the story was as vital as wielding a sword. Anne lost control of her story when others started writing it for her. And yet, centuries later, we keep hearing echoes of her voice. Elizabeth I, her daughter, deliberately styled herself as the heir of Anne's defiance. When Elizabeth wore pearls shaped like teardrops, or when she chose falcon motifs, she was, knowingly or not, resurrecting Anne's imagery. The echo travelled across generations, reshaping Anne's reputation not as a cursed witch, but as the mother of England's golden age. Still, that echo is double-edged. Even today, Anne is either saint or seductress, martyr or manipulator. Historians split between admiring her as a proto-feminist icon or condemning her as a calculating opportunist. The very fact we're still debating proves the noise hasn't stopped. It's as if Anne's ghost leaned over and whispered, "Argue about me forever, I'll never vanish." Here's a second odd tidbit. In the 17th century, a wax effigy of Anne was displayed at Westminster Abbey for a time, alongside other monarchs and nobles. Visitors gawked at her recreated face as if she'd never left. The effigy was eventually removed, but for a while it was like Anne herself was still haunting the halls of power, a silent wax echo reminding people of her presence. Another modern-style joke for you. Anne Boleyn was basically the Tudor version of clickbait. You won't believe what the Queen did to seduce the King. Number 3 will shock you. And the thing is, people clicked. They always clicked. But back to the serious undercurrent. The persistence of Anne's echo shows how fragile reputations were, and still are. Once a rumour is loosed, it becomes immortal. Try as you might, you can't put it back in the bottle. Anne's story demonstrates how narrative itself can be lethal. After all, the charges that killed her, adultery, treason, incest, were stitched together with gossip, half-truths, and outright lies. In her trial, it wasn't just evidence presented, it was rumour weaponized into law. You sit back, listening to the imagined noise of centuries and wonder, if you were Anne, would you have tried to shout above the din? Or would you have stayed silent, conserving your dignity, knowing no amount of protest could outshout the mob? Historians suggest she did both, pleading her innocence before her accusers, yet meeting death with a composed calm that left her enemies unsettled. Even silence in the end became part of the echo. The last joke, tucked in gently so you don't drift off too heavy. If Anne's ghost truly laughs in the tower, maybe it isn't mockery. Maybe it's her chuckling at the absurdity of it all. Centuries of people still arguing over whether she had an extra finger. You can almost hear her saying, "Really? That's what you're still stuck on?" And with that, the section closes not with silence, but with the endless echo of Anne Boleyn's name, reborn in every retelling, every rumour, every argument. You hear it faintly even now, like a whisper running just under the floorboards. Some stories refuse to die because the noise is the legacy. You tilt your head, half expecting quiet after all those echoes, but instead you notice something else. Symbols. Everywhere. It's as if Anne Boleyn's life was written not only in words but in objects, in motifs that clung to her and followed her even after death. You can almost reach out and touch them. Pearls strung like frozen tears, falcons spreading their wings on banners, an initial A, dangling from a chain that once rested on her chest. These symbols were her armour, her language, her brand long before Instagram logos existed. The straightforward historical fact is that Anne Boleyn had her own heraldic badge, a white falcon crowned, perched upon a tree stump from which roses burst into bloom. When she became queen, this badge appeared on pageants, tapestries, and ceremonial displays. It wasn't just decoration, it was a declaration. The falcon was a reference to the Boleyn family crest, but now it was crowned, asserting Anne's new royal identity. Imagine walking through Tudor London and seeing falcons everywhere. You'd be reminded at every corner who sat beside Henry on the throne. The quirky tidbit. Anne was known for wearing her iconic bee necklace, a bold piece of jewellery featuring a golden bee flanked by pearls. It was distinctive, almost theatrical, and portraits suggest she wore it constantly. In fact, if she were alive today, she'd basically be that person who refuses to take off their favourite pendant, even for a swim. Legend says that after her execution, the necklace was passed down and even briefly worn by her daughter Elizabeth, though historians aren't fully convinced of the chain of ownership. Whether true or not, it's deliciously poetic to imagine Elizabeth, England's virgin queen, wearing the jewellery of her condemned mother. And here lies one of the great scholarly debates. Did Elizabeth deliberately reuse Anne's symbols to rehabilitate her mother's reputation? Or was it coincidence that Elizabeth favoured similar imagery? Some historians argue Elizabeth's use of pearls, falcons, and the colour white was no accident. Others claim she was simply creating her own regal image, with no need to dredge up the scandalous memory of Anne. The question remains, was Anne's symbolism deliberately resurrected by her daughter, or did the echoes just happen naturally? Picture yourself wandering through a Tudor feast. Everywhere you look, it's like Anne's symbols are winking at you. The Queen herself walks by, her dark eyes shining, her neck adorned with the bee pendant, and her gown embroidered with falcons. You'd whisper to your neighbour, "She's bold, isn't she?" almost daring us to never forget her name. And you'd be right. Anne was branding herself in a time when women rarely had the power to shape their own image. Here comes your first joke of the section. Anne was basically the Tudor version of Apple. Sleek branding, memorable logo, total product obsession. All she needed was a falcon-shaped iPhone and her merch line would have sold out in seconds. But the humour hides something profound. Anne's use of symbolism shows her as a master of self-presentation. She couldn't control Henry's moods. She couldn't control the whispers of courtiers, but she could control the symbols people saw. Every pearl, every embroidered falcon, every scripted A was a message. I matter. I endure. I'm not just a wife. I'm a queen. Odd detail alert. Anne's falcon badge wasn't unique to her lifetime. Centuries later, a carved version of it was discovered at Hampton Court Palace, hidden in a ceiling. The badge had survived renovations, fires, and centuries of political change. It was as if Anne herself refused to be erased. Imagine being a workman in the Victorian period, tearing down some Tudor timber, and suddenly a crowned falcon stares back at you from the wood grain. Creepy, but also undeniably powerful. Second joke sliding in gently. If Anne's symbols were alive today, they'd definitely be on Etsy. Handmade Tudor falcon badge, $49.99, free shipping. You'd scroll past, maybe even add it to your cart for the aesthetic. Even in her downfall, symbols followed her. At her execution, Anne wore a dark, simple gown, but eyewitnesses claimed she still looked elegant, composed, like a queen to the end. She refused to be stripped of her dignity. Later stories suggest that when her body was hastily buried in the Tower Chapel, no marker identified her grave. But centuries later, a marble memorial was placed there, etched with her name. From falcons to letters to stone, Anne's identity never quite disappeared. It just kept shifting forms. Historians love to argue over which of her portraits are authentic. Did the iconic bee necklace really belong to her? Or was it an invention of a later artist's? Some paintings were altered in later centuries, faces smoothed, jewellery added or erased, depending on who commissioned them. The debate becomes almost absurd. Is the Anne we see in galleries truly her? Or is she already a symbol, reshaped endlessly by the brush of history? And here's your final joke for the section. Anne would have been unstoppable on TikTok. Day 47 of wearing my falcon badge. Watch Henry get obsessed again. She'd hit 1 million followers before you even finish brushing your teeth. Yet beneath the humour, the truth lingers. Anne used symbols like armour. Even when words twisted against her, her imagery endured. The falcon still perches, the pearls still gleam, and the letter B still hangs heavy in the collective memory. Close your eyes and you can almost see it. The pendant catching the candlelight, swinging ever so slightly, like it refuses to let her vanish. You're drifting deeper now. The chamber around you hushed, but the silence doesn't stay empty for long. It fills with whispers, whispers about Anne Boleyn's last hours. You lean in, because the closer you get, the stranger and more vivid the stories become. If Anne's life was filled with rumours, her death was practically built from them, each more unsettling than the last. The straightforward historical fact is stark. Anne Boleyn was executed on May 19, 1536, on Tower Green, within the Tower of London. Unlike most executions in England, she was granted a private beheading inside the walls, away from the massive crowds that usually gathered at Tower Hill. And unlike most condemned nobles, she had a special executioner imported from Calais, a French swordsman known for his speed and precision. Henry VIII arranged this, allegedly as a kindness, sparing her the clumsy hacking of an axe. Imagine that. Your estranged husband ordering Amazon Prime delivery for your executioner, the quirky tidbit. Anne is said to have tipped the executioner. Some accounts claim she handed him coins wrapped in cloth, almost like paying for a service. It's the ultimate mix of bizarre and tragic. Here's the Queen of England, condemned unjustly, politely paying her killer as though she were settling a bill at a tavern. Picture yourself standing nearby. You'd blink and whisper, "Wait, did she just tip him?" It sounds like a dark Tudor version of leaving 20% after a meal. And then comes the first of many debates. How did Anne truly behave in those final moments? Contemporary sources claim she appeared calm, dignified, even cheerful in a strange way. She addressed the crowd briefly, denying any treason but refusing to accuse Henry directly. Some say she spoke with humility, praising the king and asking God to save him. Others suspect her words were carefully shaped by necessity. She knew even a whisper of rebellion could endanger her daughter Elizabeth. Historians still argue whether Anne's composure was genuine serenity, a performance for posterity, or simply the instinct of survival, even at the brink of death. Now picture it. You stand on Tower Green that morning. The grass glistens with dew. A platform of wooden planks creaks beneath the weight of expectation. The crowd is smaller than usual, but its silence is heavier than thunder. Anne steps forward, wearing a simple gown of dark grey, her hood framing her pale face. She removes her outer garments with quiet grace, tucking her hair into a linen coif to expose her neck. The swordsman waits, calm, professional, sharpening his blade not with menace but with routine. You almost feel the absurdity. A queen, regal and intelligent, brought down not by armies, but by whispers and a man with a blade. Here's your first joke of the section. You can almost imagine the swordsman muttering, "Fast service guaranteed, or your money back." Dark humour, yes. But in the absurd theatre of Tudor executions, that's what it must have felt like. Another odd legend insists that Anne kept looking around, distracted, searching for the swordsman. He was trained to approach from behind, striking before she even realised. One account says he cried out to his assistant for a sword, tricking her into turning her head slightly. In that instant he swung. Quick, clean, efficient. Some say she never saw it coming. Others argue she must have known, must have braced herself, must have felt that split-second flicker of dread before everything ended. And now the chilling rumour. After her head fell, her lips continued to move. Witnesses claimed her eyes blinked. Her mouth formed silent words. Some swore she tried to speak Elizabeth's name. Others thought she prayed. Science tells us decapitated heads can show reflex movements for a few seconds. But imagine being there, watching the severed head of a queen trying to say something. You'd never sleep again without replaying it in your mind. Here comes your second joke to soften the chill. Anne might have been the only queen in history to make people whisper, "Did her head just throw shade?" Leave it to her to remain expressive, even without a body. Once her body and head were removed from the platform, the burial itself was shockingly careless. No grand tomb, no elaborate monument. Instead, her remains were hastily placed in an old arrow chest, too small for her frame, and buried under the floor of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. No inscription marked the spot. For centuries her grave was unmarked, lost under layers of stone. It was only in the 19th century that renovations identified her resting place, and even then certainty was shaky. Some bones found in the chapel were measured, compared, and attributed to Anne, but not all scholars are convinced they belong to her. Was the Queen of England mislaid like an unlabelled file? Historians still argue whether the bones truly match the infamous second wife of Henry VIII. Odd detail. The swordsman who beheaded her supposedly returned immediately to France afterward, almost as if he wanted nothing to do with the aftermath. It makes you wonder if even a man trained for clean executions carried with him the weight of this particular task. Beheading a noble? Routine. Beheading a queen? That might linger in the mind forever. And here's your third joke, whispered like a punchline. You'd bet your last coin that swordsman never put executed Anne Boleyn on his resume. Some gigs you just can't brag about at job interviews. As you step back from the scene in your imagination, the strangeness hits you. Anne Boleyn's final hours are remembered in fragments. Coins pressed into hands, calm words delivered to the crowd, a quick flash of steel, lips that might have moved after death. None of these details are fully certain, but together they create a haunting mosaic. She became, in that moment, both utterly human and mythic. The paradox of Anne's end is that it wasn't loud or bloody in the way you'd expect for someone who shook the foundations of England. It was quiet, efficient, wrapped in whispers, and perhaps that silence is what makes it echo louder across the centuries. You slide deeper now, half dreaming, half wandering, and the echo of Anne's last words lingers. But even as her head rests beneath the stones of the chapel, her story refuses to stay buried. That's where things get weird. Because Anne Boleyn's legacy doesn't just live in history books. It seeps into folklore, into ghost stories, into the odd corners of English imagination where fact and superstition mingle like mist. The straightforward historical fact is this. Anne Boleyn has become one of the most frequently reported ghosts in England. The Tower of London, Blickling Hall, and Hever Castle, her family's home, all claim to host her restless spirit. Tour guides will tell you her apparition is spotted more often than almost any other royal phantom. If being a ghost had a top 10 most famous list, Anne would rank higher than most rock stars. Now, the quirky tidbit, she doesn't haunt in just one outfit. Witnesses describe her ghost sometimes carrying her severed head tucked under her arm, and other times gliding headless altogether, almost like she misplaced it. One of the eeriest tales comes from Blickling Hall, where every year on the anniversary of her execution, a ghostly coach supposedly thunders up the driveway, drawn by headless horses, driven by headless coachmen, and with Anne herself riding inside, her head in her lap. Imagine being the night watchman, sipping your tea, then hearing phantom hooves rattling the stones outside. You'd quit on the spot, guaranteed. Here's your first joke of the section. You can almost picture Anne sighing, "Great, I lose my head once and now I can't go anywhere without it showing up as a prop." Talk about awkward luggage. But beyond the spooky theatrics, there's a debate that keeps scholars busy. Are these ghost stories rooted in psychological guilt? Some argue that Tudor-era servants and guards spread tales of Anne's spirit as a reflection of their own unease. After all, plenty of people in Henry's court knew she was innocent, or at least not guilty of the bizarre crimes she was accused of. Was the nation, in its collective conscience, haunted by what they'd done to her? Historians still argue whether these apparitions are genuine folklore, propaganda against Henry, or simply the way English culture deals with unresolved trauma. Back at the Tower of London, her ghost is said to wander the corridors near the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where she lies buried. Guards have sworn they've seen a woman in Tudor dress pacing silently at night, vanishing into walls. Some even claimed her spectre passed right through them, cold as ice water. And yet, in Hever Castle, her childhood home, the reports are gentler. Her spirit supposedly lingers in the gardens, especially by the great oak trees where she once played. Almost as if Anne's ghost splits its time, tragedy in one place, nostalgia in another. And here's your second joke, whispered like a smirk. You'd half expect a scheduling conflict, with Anne's ghost double-booked between the Tower and Blickling. Sorry, can't haunt the chapel tonight. I've got the creepy coach ride gig. Even in death, overcommitment is real, but not all ghost stories are centuries old. In the 20th century, a guard at the tower claimed he saw a strange flickering light in the chapel late one night. He stepped closer and swore he saw a procession of spectral ladies walking down the aisle, Anne at the front. The moment he gasped, the vision vanished. Imagine working security there. You sign up to shoo away tourists, not spectral queens with a posse. The scholarly debate goes further. What if these ghostly tales are symbolic? Some historians suggest Anne's restless spectre represents the unfinished business of the Reformation itself. She was the spark that pulled England away from Rome, and perhaps that spark still flickers, unsettled, in the imagination of the people. Others argue she's simply remembered so vividly because of her dramatic downfall. Ghost stories are how we keep tragedy alive long after it should fade. Historians still argue whether Anne's hauntings are cultural memory, superstition, or just a good way for the tower to sell more tickets. Oddly enough, Anne isn't always the scary ghost. Some accounts at Hever describe her as peaceful, almost protective. Gardeners claimed they felt watched in a kindly way, as though Anne lingered not to spook, but to remain in a place she loved. It's a softer image, not the headless queen, but a young woman still wandering among roses. Your third joke of the night. Maybe Anne haunts Hever simply to remind everyone, yes, I grew up somewhere beautiful before the whole chopping incident. Even ghosts deserve to flex their glow up. The strange thing is how Anne's ghost keeps evolving with the times. In Victorian England, she appeared in cheap penny dreadfuls as a horror figure, complete with rattling chains. In modern times, she shows up on paranormal TV shows, her story retold with night vision cameras and dramatic reenactments. She's become a cultural chameleon, adapting to whatever era is telling her tale. And so you're left with this unsettling truth. Anne Boleyn was erased physically, but she refuses to vanish. Her ghost walks in gardens, glides through chapels, thunders down driveways in headless carriages. Each story says less about Anne herself and more about how we can't let her go. You sit with that thought, listening for phantom hooves in the dark. Maybe the real haunting isn't her ghost at all. It's the fact that her story still makes you shiver, still makes you wonder centuries later. You shift deeper into the pillow, the ceiling dim and still, and you can almost hear the hushed tones of Tudor courtiers whispering in corridors lit by sputtering tallow candles. Those whispers were about Anne, your queen, though never kindly, and rarely consistently. One day she was described as dazzlingly witty, the next as hideously plain, the next as a sorceress who had somehow ensnared the most powerful man in England. It is here, in the fog of rumour and invention, that Anne Boleyn's reputation becomes its own labyrinth, a place where history bleeds into legend until you can't quite see the edges anymore. The bare historical fact, Anne was accused of witchcraft. Henry VIII, desperate to rid himself of her, leaned on the idea that she had used sorcery to seduce him. Think of it, the most commanding monarch of his age, claiming to be helpless under the spell of one clever woman. The charge appeared in legal documents, wrapped inside accusations of adultery and treason. But sorcery, that gave the scandal a darker glow, something both terrifying and convenient. After all, if Anne had bewitched Henry, then he was not weak. He was a victim of devilry. His next marriage to Jane Seymour would appear, by contrast, not lustful but necessary. But here's a quirky tidbit, the sort of detail you'd expect to hear from a gossiping maid balancing a basket of laundry. People whispered that Anne carried a secret book of charms sewn into the lining of her skirts. Others insisted she wore a small gold pendant shaped like a serpent, a symbol of forbidden knowledge. Some even claimed she had a sixth finger on her right hand, proof, so they said, of her unnatural nature. Yet eyewitnesses who knew her swore the extra finger was more like a tiny nail-like bump on her hand, if it existed at all. From there, the tale grew taller each time it was repeated, like a Tudor game of telephone. Your first joke here: if Anne were alive today, the tabloids would splash photos of her hands with captions like, Royal mistress hides cursed extra digit. Doctors hate her. The debate, though, is not so simple. Historians still argue whether Henry genuinely feared sorcery, or whether the witchcraft angle was nothing more than propaganda. Some scholars believe Henry, ever paranoid and increasingly insecure about his lack of a male heir, clung to any excuse to shift blame. Others point out that his counsellors, Cromwell especially, used the whisper of witchcraft strategically, shaping public opinion in London's taverns. Imagine a butcher in Cheapside muttering over his pint, "Did you hear? The Queen keeps charms in her sleeves." It would take only a few weeks before that rumour became truth on the streets. Anne's appearance fed this swirl of contradictions. Some portraits show her with soft oval features, elegant and delicate. Others paint her as sharp-faced with a severe expression. In letters, one ambassador described her as not the handsomest woman, while another insisted she had black and beautiful eyes that commanded attention. Was she stunning, plain, or something in between? The answer probably depended less on her face, and more on how much the viewer liked her politics. To friends she was alluring, to enemies she was grotesque. You can picture poor Anne rolling her eyes at each new caricature. Make up your minds already. Your second joke. You half expect an artist of the time to paint 3 portraits of her side by side, witch, angel, and nag, and sell them as a Tudor flipbook of moods. But the strangeness doesn't end there. Long after Anne's execution, stories spread that her ghost wandered the Tower of London carrying her head under her arm. Others claimed her spirit floated along the corridors of Hever Castle, still dressed in her French gowns, pausing sometimes to sigh at the gardens where she once walked as a girl. In Norfolk, villagers whispered that on certain nights you could see a headless horse-drawn coach racing across the countryside. Inside it, Anne Boleyn staring with eyes that glowed. Whether these stories were born from fear or fascination, they proved the point. Anne was too vivid a figure to fade quietly into history. Here's your third joke. Somewhere in the afterlife, Anne must have laughed. Really? I finally get to haunt castles and you still give me the headless treatment? Typical. And yet beneath the folklore lies something unsettling. By calling her a witch, Tudor society revealed its unease with women who wielded influence. Anne was no passive consort. She debated theology with Henry, pushed reformist ideas, and manoeuvred shrewdly in court politics. In a culture where women were expected to obey, such confidence became suspect. The easiest way to discredit her was to make her monstrous, a clever woman with ambition. To them, that was practically sorcery. This remains a point of debate even now. Some modern historians argue that Anne was intentionally demonized, painted as a witch to smooth the path for Henry's new queen. Others think the sorcery charge was more symbolic, reflecting broader cultural fears about women stepping into the male domain of politics and religion. And still others believe Anne's sharp tongue, her wit, her willingness to spar made her an easy target. After all, Henry's court adored obedient smiles, not biting sarcasm. The irony is that this witch image has outlived almost every other fact about her. In Victorian novels, she became the dark, doomed beauty who lured a king to destruction. In modern TV series, she often oscillates between manipulative schemer and tragic heroine. Each generation reshapes her to fit its anxieties. The real Anne, the laughing young woman who once practiced archery at Hever or teased her ladies-in-waiting, is buried under centuries of retellings. And that's the strangest realization of all. Anne Boleyn's reputation, like her ghost, is never still. One century casts her as a devilish seductress, the next as a feminist martyr. She is witch, saint, temptress, victim, sometimes all at once. And maybe, in the end, that's the truest curse she carried, the inability to ever be seen simply as herself. As you breathe slowly now, eyes heavy, you might wonder whether she'd prefer the silence of being forgotten or the noisy immortality of legend. Either way, she lingers in your imagination, her shadow never quite settling, her story never quite finished. The night grows quieter around you, as if the world itself is leaning in to hear one last twist of Anne's tale. You've followed her through courtly dances and whispers of witchcraft, through betrayals and legends, but now comes perhaps the strangest chapter of all, how her memory transformed into a cultural obsession long after her head fell to the straw. The bare fact, Anne Boleyn's death did not erase her. Instead, she became one of history's most reinterpreted queens, her image surfacing in art, literature, theatre, and eventually film and television. From the very moment her body was carried away in that arrow chest after the execution, stories started growing, mutating and looping back on themselves like vines in a neglected garden. Some called her a Protestant saint, others a cursed temptress, and still others the tragic heroine of a Tudor soap opera that people never seem to tire of retelling. The quirky detail: centuries later, Anne's remains may not even rest where people think they do. Officially, she was buried in an unmarked grave inside the Tower of London's chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. But when Victorian restorers dug up the chapel floor in the 19th century, they found a jumble of bones. Some they identified as Anne's, based on the age of the woman and the condition of her remains. But here's the kicker. Those identifications were little more than educated guesses. To this day, there's a chance that tourists who kneel at Anne's memorial are really kneeling above someone else's bones entirely. Historians still argue whether the Victorians rediscovered Anne or simply reburied a stranger with a famous name, and that debate about her bones, her portrait, her character, reflects the deeper truth. Anne has never belonged only to the past. She's been reinvented again and again to serve the needs of whoever was telling her story. In Elizabethan England, her daughter, Queen Elizabeth I quietly honoured her, commissioning portraits that emphasised noble lineage and Protestant virtue. In the 19th century, Victorians swooned over Anne as a romantic victim, the wronged woman who paid the price for daring to love. By the 20th century, she was the fiery anti-heroine of countless plays and novels, from Howard Brenton's biting stage portrayals to Philippa Gregory's bodice-ripping reimaginings. And in our own time, Anne stars in streaming dramas, complete with smouldering close-ups and modernised wit, her story binge-watched by millions under soft blue glow of laptops and phones. Your first joke here: if Anne had known she'd become Netflix famous 5 centuries later, she probably would have practiced her camera angles at court instead of theology debates. But there's a shadow under all that glamour. The danger of this cultural recycling is that the real Anne gets harder to find. Was she ambitious? Undoubtedly. Was she manipulative? Perhaps, but no more than anyone else navigating the shark tank of Tudor politics. Did she love Henry, or only his crown? Historians still argue whether her heart drove her actions or whether survival did. And maybe that's why her story keeps being told, because we never quite know the answer, and we're fascinated by the puzzle of her. Another strange afterlife twist. Anne has become an unlikely feminist icon. In a world where powerful women were demonized as witches or seductresses, she stands out as someone who carved space for herself where none was offered. Modern audiences look at her sharp mind, her refusal to be just another mistress, and her ability to hold her own against a king, and they see resilience, not villainy. They see the price women paid for daring to challenge expectations. They even use her as shorthand, don't go all Anne Boleyn on me, to signal how women's ambition can be punished. Your second joke, somewhere in the ether, Anne is smirking. Finally, people appreciate my sarcasm. Took you long enough. And then there are the ghost stories still swirling centuries on. Visitors to Hever Castle swear they see Anne's figure gliding across the yew maze every Christmas Eve. Tower guards claim to hear her sighs echo near the chapel. One story has her spectre crossing the River Thames in a boat of fire. You smile faintly at the absurdity, but then again, after spending hours immersed in her tangled tale, you can see why she would linger. How do you leave behind a world that won't stop arguing over you? But here's your third joke. If Anne really is haunting the tower, she's probably just standing in the ticket queue muttering, "You charged how much for admission?" And now, as your eyelids grow heavy, the final irony settles in. Anne Boleyn, accused of sorcery, branded as witch and traitor, executed as a villain, has outlasted nearly everyone who condemned her. She lives not only in history books, but in novels, plays, memes, and whispered ghost stories. Henry VIII wanted to erase her, but instead she became immortal, not in body but in story. So as you drift, picture Anne one last time, not on the scaffold, not as a ghostly shadow, but as a young woman in her prime, stepping into a candlelit chamber, a glint of laughter in her eyes, clever words on her tongue, utterly unaware that centuries later, countless voices, including yours tonight, would still be speaking her name. If you're still awake, don't worry. We'll be right here with you tonight, and together we'll drift into our second story. We drift further into Anne's strange afterlife, because you thought the chopping block was the end, right? Nope, not even close. Anne Boleyn's story doesn't slam shut with the sword. Instead, it seeps like candle smoke into the reign of her daughter, Elizabeth. You picture that. One little girl, only 2 years old when her mother lost her head, growing up surrounded by whispers, suspicions, and the weight of a blood-stained crown. You can almost hear the echoes, Anne's unfinished business rattling around in Elizabeth's rise to power, tugging her destiny in weird, sometimes spooky ways. Elizabeth ascends the throne in 1558, and everyone looks at her and sees Anne's ghost perched on her shoulder. Courtiers whisper, she has her mother's eyes, and then mutter, she'll also have her mother's downfall. You stroll through a damp Tudor corridor in your mind, tapestries sagging, a draught carrying the scent of beeswax and anxiety. It's as if every step Elizabeth takes creaks with Anne's memory. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth actively tried to distance herself from her mother's reputation or secretly used it as fuel. Some think Elizabeth wore Anne like a phantom cloak, terrifying but protective. Others insist she locked that memory away like a cursed locket. You imagine Elizabeth in the mirror fixing her iconic pale face, fiery hair piled high, pearls gleaming like drops of frozen moonlight. Behind her reflection, doesn't it feel like Anne is staring back? A reminder, your head could be next if you slip. It's the ultimate motivational speech, really, except instead of an inspirational quote on a poster, you've got your mother's beheading as a screensaver. Not exactly, hang in there, kitten, but here's a strange tidbit. Elizabeth kept surprisingly few references to her mother around. No big statues, no portraits in pride of place. It's like trying to erase Anne from the family photo album. And yet, in moments of crisis, Elizabeth invoked Anne in coded ways. One rumour says Elizabeth would occasionally wear jewellery with the letter B, a silent wink at her mother. Historians still debate if that was a real act of loyalty, or just a story embroidered later by people desperate for mother-daughter reconciliation. Either way, You get this eerie vibe. Anne hovers like smoke, unspoken but suffocating. Meanwhile, Europe watched Elizabeth's reign like it was season 2 of the same bloody drama. Catholic commentators sneered, "The bastard child of that witch now rules us?" Imagine the gossip columns of the 16th century. Pamphlets calling Elizabeth the spawn of Anne's sin. That shadow haunted her at every treaty, every speech. And yet, Elizabeth somehow weaponized it. She leaned into her mother's rebellious aura, just enough to terrify her enemies. You can almost hear Anne laughing softly in the background. Good girl, show them teeth. Now let's not forget the humour. Elizabeth's reign is often painted as this golden, glittering age, but honestly, you can't help but picture her constantly thinking, note to self, don't flirt with married men, don't let courtiers spread rumours, and definitely avoid guys with sharp swords. It's like the ultimate guide to not repeating your mum's mistakes. If Tudor England had self-help books, hers would have been called How Not to Lose Your Head, A Daughter's Tale. One of the quirkiest details people love to point out, Elizabeth supposedly inherited Anne's famous long neck. Imagine that. Your mother's most commented on feature being the very thing people watch like, I wonder if history will repeat itself. Every tilt of Elizabeth's chin, every regal pose is like a subtle reminder of what the axe once severed. Creepy, but iconic. Scholars also puzzle over Elizabeth's obsession with virginity. Was it really a political strategy, or was it haunted by Anne's fate? Think about it. Anne was accused of too much passion, too much female desire. Elizabeth flips the script and becomes the virgin queen, almost like an exorcism of her mother's scandal. Historians still argue whether this was deliberate revenge. Anne lost her life because of lustful accusations, so Elizabeth claimed purity as armour, or maybe she just didn't want messy Tudor dating drama. Honestly, who could blame her? Swipe left on every duke and prince, and then you've got the superstition. Courtiers whispered about Anne's ghost appearing near Elizabeth's chambers before major decisions. Picture Elizabeth pacing at night, candle guttering, shadows jumping on the wall, when suddenly the air chills. Was it imagination? Stress? Or her mother tapping her on the shoulder, reminding her to stand firm? That's the stuff of Tudor gossip that never made it into official chronicles, but you know people whispered it while huddled by the fire. Did you hear? The Queen's mother walks again. It's enough to make you pull your blanket tighter. Yet, amid all the weirdness, Elizabeth transforms that legacy into strength. She outlives her enemies, stabilizes the throne, and crafts an image so dazzling that you forget she was once just the daughter of an executed queen. Still, the ghost of Anne never leaves. It lingers in every pearl Elizabeth wears, every speech where she subtly insists on her legitimacy. You can almost hear Anne whispering, "Go further than I ever could." And Elizabeth does. She rules for 45 years, untouchable, untoppable. But here's the reality check. You probably wouldn't survive a single week in Elizabeth's shoes. Imagine juggling alliances, fending off assassination plots, dodging awkward marriage proposals, and trying not to end up like Mum. Meanwhile, your nightly sleep soundtrack isn't Spotify rain sounds, but the phantom clink of swords and your mother's final breath. Sweet dreams, right? So as you drift now, think of Elizabeth walking through her palace, a queen wrapped in velvet and pearls, but always with that phantom hand pressing lightly at her shoulder. The hand of Anne, reminding her of both danger and destiny. You walk beside her down that torchlit hall, the silence thick, the shadows long. The story hasn't ended. It's just taken on another shape, another haunting echo. You tiptoe further, and by now you realise Anne Boleyn's story doesn't politely fade into the footnotes of Elizabeth's reign. It mutates into whispers that slip under doors, creep along stone walls, and cling to courtiers' nerves. You imagine yourself standing in the hushed gallery of Hampton Court, a draught curling past your ankles, and someone mutters, "Don't linger too late. Anne walks here." That's right. You're entering the world of Anne's ghost stories, and let me tell you, they're plentiful. The Tower of London is ground zero, of course. Guards and visitors alike claim to see a spectral woman in Tudor dress gliding silently across the green. Some insist she carries her head tucked neatly under her arm, which is, honestly, a bit of an over-the-top special effect, like Tudor cosplay gone wrong. Others describe a headless figure simply kneeling, waiting, replaying her execution like the world's most unsettling looped video. Historians still argue whether these tales were born as propaganda to emphasise the cruelty of Henry's reign, or whether people genuinely believed Anne couldn't rest. You shiver just imagining it, her restless spirit pacing the very stones where she died. But that's not the only haunted site. Blickling Hall, the Boleyn family estate, boasts perhaps the creepiest of them all. Every May 19th, the anniversary of her death, locals say Anne returns in a carriage pulled by headless horses, her ghostly driver lashing invisible reins. And here's the kicker. Anne rides inside, holding her severed head on her lap, face pale as moonlight, eyes wide open. You'd slam the shutters if you heard those phantom wheels, right? Honestly, Uber rides are nerve-wracking enough without the whole decapitated aristocrat feature. One quirky tidbit people often overlook is that Anne's ghost sightings skyrocketed during the reign of Catholic monarchs. Was it just a coincidence, or a subtle political statement by Protestants? Seeing the wronged Protestant queen walking after death conveniently supported Elizabeth's legitimacy. Historians still debate whether these tales were propaganda disguised as supernatural folklore. In other words, Anne's ghost might have been less about spooky apparitions and more about political spin. Talk about haunting with an agenda. But don't think the Tower Guards got off lightly. Records from the 19th century mention at least one soldier fainting after swearing he saw Anne's ghost glide toward him. Picture that. Armour clanking, sword rattling, a trained soldier melting into a puddle of terror because of a pale wisp in a gown. You can't help but smile. Bravery on the battlefield, but bedtime ghost stories still win. Relatable, isn't it? And then there's Hever Castle, Anne's childhood home, which reportedly echoes with her presence too. Visitors talk about feeling cold spots in her old rooms, or catching a faint whiff of roses even when no flowers are around. Maybe Anne's perfume lingers, centuries overdue on its expiration date. Or maybe it's just mildew. Historians still argue whether this is genuine supernatural residue, or our brains playing tricks when we want history to feel alive. Either way, the idea of Anne drifting back to the halls where she once laughed as a child, that's both heartbreaking and spine-tingling. One fringe legend claims Anne's ghost doesn't confine itself to palaces and castles. Instead, she walks country lanes, passing peasants who cross themselves and hurry away. Imagine trudging home in the twilight, basket of turnips on your hip, when suddenly a headless woman in velvet brushes past you. That's one way to drop your dinner and never return to night shifts again. Honestly, medieval ghost insurance should have been a thing. What makes these tales so eerie is how they refuse to die down. Centuries later, tourists still report strange flickers of light, sudden chills, or a sense that they're being watched. Even modern skeptics strolling the tower by daylight Feel that goosebump moment where history presses too close. And whether you believe in ghosts or not, the idea that Anne remains restless is strangely fitting. She was cut off mid-story, her life guillotined into silence. Maybe her spirit never got the closure it needed. And yet, here's the odd twist. Anne's ghost isn't always portrayed as terrifying. Some accounts describe her as calm, almost protective, watching over Elizabeth's memory or silently reminding visitors of injustice. In these softer versions, Anne becomes less a shrieking phantom and more a historical guardian angel, albeit one with a seriously dramatic entrance. You almost want to whisper, "It's okay, Anne, we hear you now." Still, you can't help but imagine yourself there. It's late. The tower courtyard lies in shadow. A torch flickers. Suddenly a cold wind snakes around your neck and your chest tightens. Do you run? Or do you stand there, frozen, as a pale figure glides into view? You'd like to think you'd be brave, but let's be honest. You'd sprint faster than a Tudor messenger carrying Henry's annulment papers. So as you drift deeper tonight, imagine Anne's ghost not as a horror movie extra, but as the eternal reminder of how power, love, and betrayal can leave echoes far longer than a lifetime. You walk the same halls she walked, you breathe the same damp English air, and maybe, just maybe, you feel the same chill at your back. That's Anne, still here, still whispering, still refusing to be silenced. You keep walking through this dim Tudor dreamscape, and instead of shadowy corridors or rattling keys, you suddenly find yourself surrounded by floating scraps of parchment. They drift past your ears like moths, torn and half-burnt, covered in spidery Tudor handwriting. You reach for one, and just before it crumbles into ash, you realise you're listening to Anne Boleyn's voice, or at least the fragments of words people swore she spoke, wrote, or sang. Some are genuine, preserved in libraries. Others are inventions shaped by rumour and propaganda. And still others are so strange that even today historians shake their heads and say, maybe, or maybe not. The most famous scrap is what's often called Anne's Tower Letter. Imagine her in May 1536, imprisoned in the Tower of London, with the sounds of soldiers and distant ravens outside clutching a quill. The letter seems to plead with Henry, reminding him of her loyalty, proclaiming her innocence, and even warning him to think about his soul. It's not just a "please don't kill me" note, it's equal parts heartbreak and mic drop moral lecture. But here's the kicker. Historians still argue whether she ever wrote it. Some say the style doesn't match her hand. Others insist it's authentic. Was it Anne's last defiance, or the invention of later Protestants wanting her to sound saintly? You're left holding the letter in your imagination, wondering whether you're touching her real voice or a carefully forged ghost. And then there's her singing. Contemporary accounts whisper that Anne sang psalms softly in her tower cell, her voice echoing through the stones like lullabies to herself. Others claimed she recited prayers rhythmically, like chants, an eerie mix of devotion and self-soothing. But the fringe rumour is almost comical. Some swore she sang French love songs, chansons of heartbreak and betrayal, like a Tudor mixtape for breakups. If true, that's Anne Boleyn inventing the concept of blasting sad music when your relationship crashes, centuries before anyone had earbuds. You imagine her humming defiantly, each note both dagger and sigh. A particularly strange thread appears in alleged prophecies. Some insisted Anne had predicted that Elizabeth would rule one day, long after her own death. Now, whether she actually said anything like this is up for debate, but people adored mystical foreshadowing in Tudor England. and after Elizabeth reigned gloriously for decades, the so-called prophecy seemed vindicated. Was it really foresight, or Tudor gossip upgrading itself into legend? Historians still argue, but picture a prisoner queen saying calmly, "My child will outshine you all." Goosebumps. That's either faith in her daughter or the ultimate parting shot. Another quirky remnant comes from Anne's own prayer book, which still exists. In its margins there's handwriting believed to be hers, with little messages like, "Remember me when you do pray." It's strangely intimate, less a queen's command, more a personal plea. You might expect grandeur, but instead you get something that feels like a doodle in the back of a notebook, as if Anne knew someone someday would flip through and pause at her words. That little scribble might be the most authentic piece of her voice we have, simple, almost ordinary, which ironically makes it extraordinary. But not all her supposed words were flattering. Enemies accused her of bragging that she could control Henry however she wanted. Some chroniclers, writing with venom, put sharp lines in her mouth about manipulating men, mocking courtiers, or even laughing at Catherine of Aragon's suffering. Were these exaggerations meant to make her look like a villainess? Probably. Yet they show how malleable Anne's voice became. Friends wanted her remembered as noble, enemies as arrogant, and centuries later writers still cherry-pick lines to build their Anne. Her last words on the scaffold, though, were carefully recorded. Witnesses remembered her speaking with composure, thanking God, declaring Henry a good king, and praying for mercy. No angry speeches, no dramatic accusations, just humility. It sounds too neat, right? Scholars argue whether her tone was genuine forgiveness or deliberate performance. Imagine standing on the scaffold, hundreds of eyes on you, and knowing your words will be repeated for centuries. Would you rage, or would you curate your exit like an influencer setting their last post? If Anne did the latter, she succeeded spectacularly. Her speech still circulates as one of history's most chillingly graceful farewells, and because humans cannot resist adding spice, fringe legends claim she scrawled secret messages in tower walls with a pin, visible only when candlelight flickered just right. No surviving walls bear her name, but wouldn't that be the ultimate tourist discovery? Forget postcards. Anne leaving behind. Anne was here, 1536. In crooked script would have been priceless. And part of you, in this nighttime wandering, almost sees it. Faint letters glinting under your imaginary torch. What's most haunting is that Anne's voice is never singular. It's layered. Prayers, accusations, love letters, laments, witty remarks, humble speeches, forged propaganda. She exists simultaneously as the heartbroken wife, the manipulative schemer, the faithful mother, the political martyr, and the soft singer. Each historian chooses which Anne to believe. Each listener hears a slightly different tone. And you? You're left wondering whether those whispered fragments you heard just now were hers at all, or merely echoes people invented to fill the silence she left behind. As you drift here, the scraps of parchment dissolve completely, leaving you in darkness once more. But in that silence, the faintest whisper remains. A line of prayer, or a French tune, or maybe just your own thoughts looping back. And like every ghost worth remembering, Anne's words will linger, stubbornly, whether they were truly hers or not. The silence after those drifting scraps doesn't last long. Suddenly you sense movement under your feet, as though you've stepped onto a hidden staircase spiraling downward. Each step creaks like bone, and when you finally land, you're in a cavernous Tudor kitchen. But this isn't just pots and firewood. It's stuffed with peculiar trinkets, whispers of medicine, charms and remedies tied to Anne's presence. You're about to rummage through the weird Tudor equivalent of a bathroom cabinet crossed with a witch's cupboard. You reach for a bundle hanging from a beam, dried herbs. Ordinary enough. Except someone once claimed Anne carried them in sachets sewn discreetly into her gowns to protect against bad humours and infection. Tudor people believed diseases floated in foul air, so scented herbs weren't just perfume, they were survival tools. Imagine Anne at court stepping into a crowded hall, secretly sniffing lavender and rosemary like a medieval germaphobe. You suddenly realise that pocket hand sanitizers and those weird stress relief sprays at stores are just the modern version of Anne's herbal packets. Different century, same paranoia. On a nearby table sits a bowl of crushed pearls mixed with vinegar. Yes, pearls. People in the Tudor court genuinely believed ground pearls could serve as both medicine and cosmetic. There's a fringe rumour Anne drank pearl tonic to strengthen her heart, or even as a fertility aid. Picture it, sipping jewellery like a luxury smoothie. You can't decide if that's elegance or a sign she'd lose in a survivalist reality show. Scholars still argue whether this practice was common or mostly exaggerated gossip, but the sheer image of pearls dissolving in acid lingers, both decadent and absurd. Then you notice bottles lined along the wall, labelled in shaky Tudor script. One is dragon's blood, not the fantasy creature you're thinking of, but a resin used in medieval medicine for wounds and inflammation. Did Anne believe in it? Possibly. Did she let others think she did just to fit courtly expectations? Definitely possible. Another bottle claims to hold powdered unicorn horn, which was often just narwhal tusk imported at ridiculous prices. Imagine Anne receiving a vial of it as a gift, smiling politely while thinking, "Ah yes, totally authentic unicorn." The Tudors were basically pioneers of luxury scams, but beyond quirky tonics, you stumble upon something stranger. Tiny charms shaped like hands and crosses, tucked into silk pouches. These were amulets, meant to protect fertility, pregnancy, or ward off bad luck. Rumour swirled that Anne resorted to them in desperation when her pregnancies ended in miscarriage. Of course, her enemies twisted this, accusing her of witchcraft. The same objects seen as everyday superstition could be weaponized into evidence of devilry when politically convenient. Historians still argue whether Anne actually used such charms, or if the whole idea was retroactively pasted onto her image to make her sound unholy. You can almost hear the gossips whispering, "She couldn't give the king a son, so she must be dabbling in spells." The kitchen fireplace flickers, and for a moment you imagine Anne herself leaning over a pot, not as a cook but as someone being whispered about. Some said she prepared strange potions, maybe even aphrodisiacs to keep Henry infatuated. One fringe tale insisted she gave him love draughts, like something out of a fairy tale, except instead of fairy dust it was probably wine laced with herbs. Whether true or not, the rumour reveals how unnerved people were by Henry's obsession with her. How else could they explain a king upending his entire kingdom for one woman? Surely it had to be sorcery. Or maybe, just maybe, Henry was as reckless and impulsive as he looked. Next to the fire sits a cracked mirror, the glass fogged and warped. In Tudor belief, mirrors weren't just reflective, they were portals. Vulnerable points where spirits could sneak through. Imagine the gossip. Anne gazing at her face before bed, running her hands over her famous long neck, while superstitious ladies whispered, "She's inviting demons by staring too long." Of course, in reality she was probably just checking if her French hood sat right. But perception was everything, and even daily grooming became fodder for myth. You turn and spot a tiny locked chest. Inside you picture letters bundled with ribbon, perhaps recipes for beauty creams. One recipe from that era called for mixing ground alabaster with egg whites for a smooth complexion. Another bizarre option was donkey's milk baths, rumoured to soften skin. Would Anne have tried these? Possibly. Would her critics later twist it into evidence of vanity and unnatural arts? Absolutely. Even skincare became part of her mythos. Picture a queen just trying to deal with Tudor acne while gossipers accuse her of devilry. Some things never change. One last oddity sits in the corner, a clay pot filled with what looks like ashes. When you lean close, you imagine the whispers of old midwives saying it was ground mumia. Yes, literally powdered human remains imported from Egypt, sold as medicine. Tudor elites thought consuming it cured illness. The idea that Anne might have touched or tasted it adds a grotesque, almost gothic detail to her world. Whether she did or not, the presence of such cures reminds you how thin the line was between science and superstition. As you stand there, surrounded by herbs, charms, shimmering powders and whispering rumours, the air feels thicker. You realise that none of these objects prove anything concrete about Anne, but they illustrate how she was imagined. A queen clutching herbs could be a woman protecting her health, or a witch summoning spirits, depending on who told the story. You can't escape the sense that Anne's body, her habits, even her skincare, were constantly watched and reinterpreted. And just as suddenly the kitchen darkens, the herbs crumble to dust, the bottles vanish, the mirror fogs completely. You're left with the faintest scent of rosemary and lavender, ordinary, almost soothing. For a moment it feels less like sorcery and more like survival, a queen fighting bad air and gossip with the only tools she had. The lavender haze you were drifting in doesn't quite vanish, it just changes tune. Instead of gentle fragrance, there's now music, thin and wavering, like a thread pulled through the dark. A lute string plucked once, twice, and then a full chord settles into the night air. When you open your eyes again, you're not in your room, not even in a palace kitchen. You're perched at the edge of a crowded Tudor tavern, and every plank of the floor groans under the weight of bodies pressed together. The smell of ale and roasted meat clings thick in the air. Smoke curls lazily from the rush torches pinned to the walls, and a ripple of anticipation moves through the crowd. On a stool, 1 foot hooked around the rung, sits a balladeer with eyes too tired for his age. His fingers dance on the strings of his lute, and the words that slip from his mouth are not neutral, not kind, not careful. They carry venom. Anne, the jade, serpent-eyed, who ensnared a king. The crowd listens, mouths half open, tankards frozen halfway to lips. The melody isn't written in any royal record, but here it lives, passed hand to hand, mouth to mouth. You've entered the strange universe of ballads and street songs, where Anne Boleyn's story was not carved into marble but hammered into rhyme. What's startling is how quickly gossip became performance. These weren't just whispers, they were singable, repeatable, shareable, long before TikTok existed. Imagine the tavern patrons humming the chorus on their walk home, repeating the scandal like it was breaking news. For many, this was the only news. They couldn't read proclamations nailed to church doors, but they could sure remember a dirty lyric sung to a catchy tune. And dirty some of them were. Catholic ballads cast Anne as nothing less than a witch. Verses described her eyes like needles, her voice like a serpent's hiss, her touch cursed. To devout listeners who'd watched Henry toss aside Catherine of Aragon and the Pope's authority, it wasn't just court gossip, it was divine betrayal. Every rhyme confirmed that England's queen was the devil's mistress. One ballad circulating in Spanish ports gleefully told how God would smite her barren womb. You picture sailors swaying to it after too much wine, spitting curses between choruses, but cross the channel, the tune shifted. Some Protestant songs reframed Anne as a victim, brave, even saintly. One painted her scaffold speech as a kind of sermon, her calmness proof she died with God's grace. Another described her as a lamb among wolves, devoured by jealous courtiers. To sing these words was an act of loyalty, maybe even rebellion. And isn't it wild to think of Anne's image morphing so dramatically? In Spain, she's a sorceress. In certain English towns, she's a Protestant heroine. Same woman, different melody, depending on whose strings were being plucked. And then came the jokes. You can almost hear one comic ditty ripple across the room. The king would wed a broom if it wore French lace. The crowd chuckles nervously. After all, laughing at Henry's choices was dangerous, but humour has always been humanity's armour. Just as today we meme celebrity scandals, Tudor taverns had their own low-tech memes in rhyme. Singers poked fun at Henry's obsession, painting him as a lovesick fool chasing Anne like a hound after a hare. Did people laugh quietly into their cups? Probably. Did they risk singing it too loudly on the street? Probably not, unless they enjoyed the idea of decorating a pike on London Bridge. Some songs, though, carried an eerie chill. Travellers spoke of darker ballads in which Anne's severed head continued to sing from the scaffold. In these versions, her ghost warned women not to trust crowns or kings. Whether such verses were real or imagined hardly mattered. They gave people goosebumps. Ballads weren't just entertainment. They were moral lessons, campfire stories, and urban legends all rolled into a few stanzas. Even more curious are the half-forgotten refrains scholars dig up today. Many exist only in scraps, lines copied down in hostile pamphlets, fragments in court records. One historian argues these scraps are like the tabloids of their day, sensational, exaggerated, designed to stir outrage. Another insists that they reflect the pulse of the people, voices rarely recorded otherwise. And yet, historians still argue whether the average Englishman saw Anne as witch, martyr, or just another noblewoman above their station. The truth? Probably all three, depending on the night and the song. And think about it. These ballads travelled faster than any royal decree. A printed pamphlet might reach Londoners, but a drunk sailor singing in a port could carry Anne's reputation across counties in a single evening. It's like the 16th century equivalent of going viral. You almost want to imagine some minstrel chasing clout. Hey lads, my ballad about Anne got picked up in Calais. Didn't even have to bribe a bard. There's a strange intimacy in imagining those voices. A farmhand humming a scandalous refrain while sowing seed. A maidservant muttering a warning ballad under her breath as she scrubbed a floor. Children giggling at a rhyme they didn't fully understand, repeating Anne's name without grasping the weight of it. Ballads stitched Anne into the daily life of people who would never see a royal palace, let alone a queen. And here's the kicker. You're part of the same tradition. Every documentary you binge, every novel you flip through, every late-night YouTube history video, all of it is just another kind of ballad, reshaped for a modern tavern with glowing screens instead of smoky torches. Anne's reputation still lives in the mouths of strangers, carried forward in retellings that are just as biased, just as colourful, and sometimes just as unfair as the tavern songs of 500 years ago. The lute player in the corner plucks his final chord, the tavern holds its breath, and then a murmur of voices swells as the song fades. Tankards clink, laughter bubbles up, the air shifts back to smoke and sweat. But as the scene dissolves and you blink yourself back into silence, the refrain lingers. Was Anne a serpent? A saint? A victim? A temptress? You'll never get one answer. Ballads refuse to give one, and history hasn't either. The song goes on, just in different keys. The tavern fades. The ballad's last echo is still in your ears when suddenly a new kind of stage rises before you. No smoky alehouse this time, but a wooden theatre, circular and open to the sky. The boards creak beneath the weight of actors in velvet. The air smells faintly of oranges, and the murmur of a crowd grows like a tide. Welcome to the globe, or rather, to a dreamlike version of it. You're about to witness how Anne Boleyn didn't just haunt tavern songs. She drifted into literature itself, and perhaps most famously, into the shadow of a certain playwright with a receding hairline and a sharp quill. William Shakespeare. The play is Henry VIII, sometimes subtitled All is True. Curiously, it isn't one of Shakespeare's most popular works, but in its own strange way, it is one of the most theatrical. Fire literally broke out during one of its earliest performances in 1613, when a cannon fired for effect set the globe's thatched roof ablaze. Imagine that. Anne's story not only shook a kingdom, but quite literally burned down a theatre. In this dramatised retelling, Anne is not the sly temptress of the ballads, nor the saint of Protestant martyrdom. Shakespeare, alongside his collaborator John Fletcher, carved her into something softer, a figure of grace and modesty, surprisingly humble, even reluctant about her rise. She seems almost allergic to ambition, painted as a pawn swept along by fate rather than a player of the game. It's almost jarring, isn't it? After hearing tavern singers hiss about her serpent eyes, now you watch an Anne who demurs, who blushes, who accepts fortune with sighs instead of schemes. The mainstream fact here is easy. Shakespeare's Henry VIII is one of the most enduring literary depictions of Anne Boleyn, shaping how audiences for centuries imagined her. But the odd little tidbit is this: Shakespeare never shows Anne's downfall. The play ends before the axe falls. Instead, it leaps to the birth of Elizabeth, basking in prophetic speeches about England's golden future. It's as if the playwrights held up Anne not as a cautionary tale, but as a womb, a vessel necessary for Elizabeth's coming glory. Talk about historical editing. You might almost chuckle, imagining Anne herself rolling her eyes. Excuse me, I was more than just a uterus, thank you very much. Scholars debate endlessly about this version. Was it deliberate propaganda, polishing Anne's image to flatter Elizabeth's legacy only a few decades after her death? Or was it political caution? Why dwell on execution when you could highlight triumph? Some argue that the gentle Anne of Shakespeare's stage is less about who she was and more about who she birthed. Others point out that audiences in 1613 were living under King James, not Elizabeth. So maybe the play was carefully crafted to honour the past while soothing present politics. A neat balancing act, you might say, one that kept heads firmly on shoulders. Yet even within this softened portrait you sense something haunting. When Shakespeare gives Anne words of humility, "I am the simplest woman in my kingdom," is that really a compliment or a warning? Did he mean to contrast her simplicity with the storm to come, the court's duplicity, Henry's tyranny? The audience may not see her fall, but they already know it. Every sigh, every modest glance carries the ghost of a scaffold. It's a theatrical trick. You don't need to show the tragedy when the shadow of it stretches over every scene. But Anne's literary afterlife wasn't confined to Shakespeare's pen. Other plays, pamphlets and poems sprouted like weeds across the 17th century. Some leaned on the witch trope, giving her talons and curses. Others tried to paint her as a wise counsellor, unfairly crushed by politics. and a few surprisingly cast her as comic relief, a flirtatious French woman with quick wit and quicker downfall. Isn't it strange how a single woman could be remade into saint, witch and clown, depending on who held the quill? Even stranger, Shakespeare himself never gave Anne a soliloquy, no great outpouring of inner thought, unlike his tragic heroines like Lady Macbeth or Juliet. She remains curiously mute in comparison, more acted upon than acting, and that silence too has fueled debate. Was Anne's quietness an act of erasure, history silencing her yet again? Or did Shakespeare and Fletcher intend her modesty as dignity, leaving space for the audience to project what they knew of her fate? Either way, you're left with a portrait that is both present and absent, vivid and hollow. Picture the Globe audience in 1613, apprentices jostling in the pit, nobles reclining in galleries, all straining to see the actress playing Anne in her embroidered gown. Did they whisper about how much she resembled, or didn't resemble, the real queen their parents had feared or admired? Did some of them secretly hum tavern ballads under their breath, thinking how different this Anne looked compared to the serpent-eyed woman of the songs? The theatre, like the tavern, became another space where Anne lived multiple lives at once. And here's a modern twist for you. Every time a new production of Henry VIII is staged, Anne's shadow shifts again. Some directors play her as innocent, others as slyly ambitious beneath a mask of humility. Costume designers fuss over the French hood. Do they make it glamorous or austere? Actors debate whether to let her voice tremble or ring with quiet steel. 500 years on, she's still being rewritten. Shakespeare may have left her in the shadows, but performers keep coaxing her back into the light. As the play dissolves in your dreamscape, the applause fades to a rustle, like leaves in the dark. You realise Anne's ghost doesn't just live in ballads or biographies, it lingers in scripts, waiting for another actor, another stage, another interpretation. And so, while the tavern songs mocked her and the histories judged her, literature carved her into a shape audiences could sit with, mourn with, perhaps even forgive. The theatre's torches sputter out. You blink again, half asleep. Anne recedes into the boards, her figure no longer solid but a suggestion, a role waiting to be played. And in that fading moment, you feel the weight of Shakespeare's shadow, that curious half-presence that has kept her alive, if only in echoes and lines half-spoken. The theatre smoke clears, and the dream shifts again. Now you find yourself not in London, but in a candlelit chamber somewhere on the continent, Antwerp, perhaps, or Rome. The scent of incense lingers in the air. The voices you hear are Latin, solemn and accusatory. This is no tavern ballad, no Shakespearean stage. This is the realm of Catholic chroniclers, pamphleteers, and polemicists. And here, Anne Boleyn wears not the crown of a queen, or the halo of a martyr. No, here she is draped in horns and serpents, a temptress, a Jezebel, the villainess of the Reformation. You might have guessed that Anne's enemies didn't sit quietly after her execution. For Catholic Europe, she was not merely the second wife of Henry VIII. She was the very symbol of schism, the spark that ignited England's break with Rome. And so, in pamphlets and chronicles circulated across France, Italy and Spain, Anne was painted in venomous colours. Her alleged deformities were magnified into proof of her unnaturalness. Her French upbringing became a shorthand for corruption. Her wit was recast as cunning, her laughter as mockery of the faith. The mainstream fact here is clear. Catholic propagandists fashioned Anne into the villainess of their story, casting her as Eve to Henry's Adam, the snake that whispered England out of the Garden of Rome. But here's the odd little tidbit. Some pamphlets claimed she literally enchanted Henry with sorcery. Others swore that she had bewitched him by feeding him potions, or that she employed charms sewn into her gowns. One even suggested that the strange sixth finger rumour wasn't just deformity. It was the devil's mark, proof that she had signed her body over to Satan himself. It sounds absurd to modern ears, yet for centuries these whispers shaped her European reputation far more than her English portraits did. Imagine yourself holding one of those pamphlets, the paper rough beneath your fingers. The woodcut on the front shows Anne not as a queen, but as a kind of grotesque caricature. Pointed chin, glaring eyes, her French hood drawn like horns. The text describes her as the woman who led Henry into adultery, heresy and blood. She isn't just blamed for Catherine of Aragon's humiliation, but for the dissolution of monasteries, for the executions of priests, even for the chaos of rebellion. One woman made into a scapegoat for an entire continent's grievances. But here's where the scholar in you leans closer. How much of this was genuine belief, and how much was political theatre? The Catholic writers knew their audiences. For Spaniards, she was the destroyer of Catherine, their beloved Infanta. For Italians, she was the enemy of the Pope. For French Catholics, she was a betrayal of their own nation, a daughter of France who became the ruin of Christendom's unity. Each audience needed a villain, and Anne, dead and silent, was a perfect vessel. And yet, the propaganda didn't stop at words. Rumours seeped into art too. In some paintings you find shadowy figures that supposedly depict her, not crowned, but marked by lewdness, bare shoulders, suggestive eyes, the posture of a courtesan. None of these portraits are authentic likenesses, but they fed the image of Anne as a seductress whose only power was her body. How different from Shakespeare's meek Anne. You almost have to laugh in a bitter way. She was too modest for the stage, too lascivious for the church, and somehow both at once in the imagination of history. What's most chilling, though, is how enduring these depictions were. Well into the 17th century, Catholic writers still published venom about Anne. Even Jesuit accounts of Elizabeth I's reign would point a finger at Anne, though she had been dead for decades, describing the Queen as the bastard offspring of Henry's lust and Anne's witchcraft. Some went so far as to argue that Elizabeth's very brilliance, her sharpness of mind, was itself evidence of demonic inheritance. Imagine the intelligence of the daughter as proof of the devil in the mother. But pause a moment. Don't fall entirely into the trap of villainizing the villainizers. Remember too that propaganda cuts both ways. For Catholics, Anne's story was not just about her. It was about the trauma of losing England, the bitterness of watching a kingdom turn from the Pope's authority. Anne was not merely a woman. They made her into an allegory. And in that sense, her ghost haunted not just England, but the entire map of Europe, flitting through pamphlets, sermons, and whispered curses. Strangely, there's even a hint of backhanded admiration buried in some of these depictions. To portray Anne as a sorceress, after all, was to admit she had power, real power, enough to sway a king and topple a church. The very horror they wrote was also a kind of acknowledgement. This woman mattered. She was not forgettable. Better to paint her as monstrous than to allow her to vanish. Now imagine yourself drifting deeper into the candlelight. You hear the scrape of quills, the mutter of prayers, the scratch of pamphlets being pressed. You picture couriers carrying these papers across borders, dropping them in marketplaces, whispering Anne's name like a curse. And you realise in that half-sleep haze that Anne's afterlife was larger than her life. Her body lay buried under stone at the tower, but her image was carried across Europe like a phantom, reshaped by every hostile hand that touched it. So here lies the paradox. To her enemies, Anne Boleyn was the Catholic villain. To make her so, they had to keep her alive, and in keeping her alive they ensured she would never truly vanish. The candle gutters out, darkness folds over the chamber, and in that darkness you feel the weight of centuries of accusation, the hiss of ink on paper. Anne's ghost has changed costumes yet again, no longer saint or heroine, but witch, harlot, devil's bride. And in this dream, you cannot quite tell whether she smiles or scowls at the thought. The dream tilts again, as though your mind is a stage where the same figure keeps stepping out in new disguises. Gone is the candlelit Catholic chamber. Now you're carried to an English parish hall, the air thick with wood smoke and the smell of damp wool. A preacher stands at the front, his voice echoing off the rafters. The congregation leans in, faces pinched from hunger and fear. And what name does he speak? Anne Boleyn. Not as witch, not as temptress, but as chosen instrument of God. England's Protestant heroine, the mother of a queen, a martyr whose blood watered the soil of Reformation. It's almost dizzying, the contrast. The same woman who was vilified as Satan's mistress in Rome was sanctified as a kind of Protestant saint in London. This transformation began not long after her death. Her supporters, those who had profited from Henry's break with Rome, those who feared a Catholic restoration, needed to defend her memory. They painted her execution not as justice, but as a tragedy engineered by scheming enemies, a martyrdom that revealed the corruption of both papists and courtiers. The factual base is clear. By Elizabeth III's reign, Anne's reputation was reshaped to serve the Protestant story. Chroniclers described her as pious, generous to the poor, committed to the English Bible. One anecdote, repeated so often it became a legend, claimed that Anne had given her own copy of the English New Testament to her maids, instructing them to read it aloud. Another tale suggested that she interceded with Henry to spare humble prisoners, softening the king's brutality with her mercy. But here's where the odd little details creep in. Some writers claim that Anne was almost prophetic, that she foresaw the birth of Elizabeth as the dawn of England's new faith. Others insisted that she had died with serene calm, quoting scripture, like a martyr stepping into heaven. And in pamphlets distributed during Elizabeth's reign, Anne's French education was no longer a source of suspicion, but proof of her refinement and wisdom. What Catholics twisted into witchcraft, Protestants recast as virtue. You picture the congregation in that parish hall, the preacher's words filling the room. She who suffered unjustly at the hands of papist conspirators, he proclaims, gave to this nation its great Elizabeth. The listeners nod, not just because it flatters their queen, but because it gives their suffering meaning. If Anne had died for the truth of God's word, then their hardships, rebellions, wars, persecutions, could be endured as part of the same divine struggle. The paradox deepens. Catholic Europe made Anne the mother of heresy. Protestant England made her the mother of faith. And in both cases her body, executed and silent, became a tool in someone else's argument. She was reshaped into allegory, one mask traded for another, one script overwritten by the next. The more you listen, the stranger it feels. A pamphlet is passed around, its woodcut showing Anne with a halo of light around her head. In some versions, she's kneeling with a Bible in her hands. In others, she's depicted almost like a saint, eyes raised heavenward, as though her execution was less a tragedy than a triumph. This image would have scandalized her Catholic enemies, but to Protestant printers, It was powerful propaganda. And then there are the whispered legends that seem almost too convenient. One story claimed that when Anne mounted the scaffold, her blood flowed into the shape of a cross upon the straw. Another swore that the executioner himself trembled, sensing he was striking down God's chosen. None of these tales can be verified, but truth was not the goal. Meaning was. For Protestants struggling to anchor their identity, Anne was a symbol that the English Church had divine favour. But here's where you pause, lying in your dreamlike half-sleep, and wonder, what did Anne herself believe? She owned religious books, true. She encouraged the spread of certain reformist texts, yes. Yet she also attended Mass, made conventional gestures of piety, and lived in a world where belief was fluid and dangerous. Was she truly a Protestant martyr? Or was she simply a woman navigating the treacherous tides of Henry's court? Her reputation later carved to fit the needs of others. The silence of her own voice leaves the question open. What remains is the story others told for her, and that story hardened into myth during Elizabeth's reign, when it was politically vital to connect the Queen's legitimacy to her mother's sacrifice. Imagine being Elizabeth herself, hearing preachers praise Anne as a godly woman wronged by papists. Did she feel comfort? Or did she feel the sting of knowing her mother's real life was being overwritten by a golden fable? As you drift deeper into the dream, you hear the preacher's voice fade into a chorus. It isn't just one parish, but hundreds. Not just one pamphlet, but scores. In them, Anne becomes radiant, unflawed, a vessel of divine will. This Anne bears little resemblance to the woman mocked in Catholic pamphlets, and perhaps little resemblance to the historical Anne herself. But she is powerful nonetheless. She gives Protestants a past to be proud of, a martyr to venerate, a queen mother to revere. The irony is almost too much to bear. The same Anne who was demonized as villain by Catholics was canonized as heroine by Protestants. Both depictions flatten her complexity, both erase her contradictions, and yet both ensured her immortality. Her bones lay under the tower stones, but her image walked free, in pulpits, in pamphlets, in whispered prayers, in secret songs. The fire in the parish hall dwindles, shadows lengthen, and you realise the preacher has stopped. Silence pools in the room. The congregation bows their heads, and for a moment you feel the weight of belief pressing down, thick and heavy. Belief not just in God, but in Anne, as though her ghost is here too, listening. And as you close your eyes, you sense that her ghost does not mind this version as much as the others. For once she is not vilified. For once she is not mocked. She is lifted, honoured, remembered not as witch or adulteress, but as mother, martyr, and symbol of a faith reborn. Whether true or not, it is a kinder mask for the restless queen to wear. The dream does not end with words from pulpits. It shifts again, as though unseen hands are pulling you into another chamber. This one is darker, quieter, lined not with people but with objects. A glass case here, a locked chest there, shelves sagging under the weight of centuries. The air smells of dust and candle wax. You realise you've wandered into a strange museum, not the sort with neat placards and tidy exhibits, but a shadowy hall where the relics of Anne Boleyn are said to rest. No one greets you, yet you feel watched. A small velvet cushion lies beneath the first case. On it, an old book. The leather is cracked, the gilt lettering faded. It is a French psalter, and beside it, a note claims Anne Boleyn's own prayer book, carried to the scaffold in 1536. The handwriting in its margins trembles with age, but one line is clear. Remember me when you do pray. Was it really Anne's? Some experts believe so, pointing to the inscription, the provenance, the trail of ownership that leads back to her household. Others call it wishful thinking, a romantic forgery. Yet the aura is undeniable. Visitors swear that when they gaze too long at the book, the room feels colder, as though the pages themselves carry the frost of her final morning. You step farther in. A chain of golden links glimmers under low light. This too is labelled as hers. Anne's necklace, perhaps the very one she wore in her portraits, with the letter B dangling bold against her chest. How many times did she clasp it before stepping into court, before facing a king, before walking to her doom? The chain seems harmless, but stories cling to it like cobwebs. In the Victorian era, when relic collecting was nearly a mania, a certain lady supposedly wore the necklace for a dinner party. Before the night was over, she fainted, her skin fevered, and she died within a week. A coincidence? Likely. Yet the tale stuck, and whispers spread. Anne's jewels are cursed, their sparkle concealing centuries of sorrow. Across the hall lies something stranger still, a lock of dark hair pressed into a miniature frame. Some swear it was clipped from Anne's head by a sympathetic maid, kept as a private relic of loyalty. The hair is brittle now, almost black against the pale fabric beneath. But legends multiply around it. One says that the lock was once placed under the pillow of a bride on her wedding night to ensure fertility, an echo of Anne's tragic failures to give Henry sons. Another claims the hair was carried into battle by a Protestant soldier who believed Anne's memory would shield him. Whether the stories are truth or invention hardly matters. The lock glows with the weight of belief. Then there are relics more sinister. A silver goblet, its rim dented, rumoured to have been used by Anne during her final meal in the Tower. A tiny piece of cloth, said to be a shred of the gown she wore to her execution. A wooden block, no one can prove it, belonged to the scaffold, but people insist that placing a hand upon it brings shivers, sometimes visions of straw soaked dark with blood. Objects, ordinary in themselves, transformed into talismans of dread. You begin to notice a pattern. Wherever Anne's name attaches, objects acquire stories. They become vessels for anxiety, for fascination, for longing. In some she is saint. Her prayer book brings peace, her hair ensuring love. In others she is curse, her necklace killing, her cup poisoning, her scaffold block haunting. The relics mirror the contradictions of her life, split between sanctity and suspicion, martyrdom and damnation. And yet, not all these relics are real. Many are inventions of later centuries, especially the Victorians who adored tragic queens. Dealers forged items, sewing scraps of anonymous cloth into execution dresses, carving initials into prayer books, spinning fables of locks and jewels. But the fakery itself became part of the legend. It hardly mattered if the relic was genuine. What mattered was the thrill it offered, the chance to hold a piece, real or imagined, of Anne Boleyn. You linger at one final case. Inside, a delicate ring with a secret hinge. When opened, it reveals two portraits, one of Henry VIII, the other of Anne. Whether authentic or not, the symbolism bites deep. Two faces trapped forever in a circle of gold, yet separated by betrayal and death. The ring closes with a snap, locking them together once more, as though history refuses to release its grip. Around you, the hall grows colder. You feel the weight of all those objects, all those claims, all those centuries of people needing to touch Anne, even if only through things. Perhaps that is what relics truly are. Not treasures of the dead, but mirrors of the living. They reveal what people want from the past: comfort, warning, romance, fear. Your eyelids grow heavy as you stare at the prayer book again. Remember me when you do pray. The words blur, swim, twist into whispers. You almost hear Anne herself repeating them, as though her ghost is not content with sermons or myths. She lingers in objects, in hair, in jewels, in fragile pages stained with ink. She lingers because people will not let her go. And so the relics breathe, cursed or blessed, endlessly passed down, endlessly reinterpreted. As sleep drags you deeper, you realise something unsettling. Perhaps Anne's ghost does not walk the tower at all. Perhaps she walks here, in the objects that bear her name, and when strangers reach out trembling hands to touch her necklace, her prayer book, her hair, they invite her in. The hall fades, the relics dissolve, but the whisper remains. Remember me. The dream shifts again. The relics dissolve, the shadows recede, and now you find yourself in a library lit by gas lamps. Dust motes swim in the heavy air, and tall shelves groan with books bound in cracked leather. You sense another age, the 19th century, when England was drunk on its past, when Victorians rummaged through history like children prying into forbidden cupboards. They adored tragic queens, and Anne Boleyn was one of their favourites. Yet in this era, one detail above all captured their imagination: the rumour of her sixth finger. It was not a new rumour. Even in the 16th century, whispers had claimed that Anne was marked by deformity, a small extra finger on her right hand, or perhaps only a malformed nail. Her enemies at court whispered it as evidence that she was unnatural, touched by the devil, unfit for a crown. Some even said she had a mole on her neck, a wen, a witch's mark. None of her portraits show such things, nor did her supporters ever mention them. But centuries later, in the candlelit fascination of the Victorian imagination, the tale revived with strange force. You drift closer to a table where a book lies open. Its title, stamped in fading gold, Lives of the Queens of England by Agnes Strickland. In its pages, Strickland describes Anne's supposed extra finger with cautious delicacy, as though both doubting and yet relishing the grotesque rumour. Readers lapped it up. Here was proof, they felt, that beauty is never perfect, that behind Anne's allure lurked something uncanny, something that foreshadowed her fall. The sixth finger became a fascination. Engravers produced images exaggerating the hand, as though she carried a visible flaw even while posing in regal finery. Novelists embroidered it, crafting passages where the king first noticed the deformity, then ignored it for love, only to see in it later a symbol of her corruption. For Victorians it was irresistible, a tiny physical abnormality inflated into destiny, as if history itself were written on the body. In drawing rooms and parlours, amateur historians argued, did she truly have the finger? If so, was it removed by clever surgeons before her marriage? Or was it a mere wart or nail grown askew, magnified by scandal? The more uncertain the truth, the more the rumour grew. It offered what Victorians craved: mystery clothed in science, a freakish detail that could be dressed in medical language and yet still whispered about like a ghost story. Some saw the sixth finger as evidence of witchcraft, echoing older superstitions. A witch, after all, might bear extra digits, marks, or growths. To those inclined toward Gothic drama, Anne's deformity was proof that she had ensnared Henry with sorcery rather than beauty. Others twisted the tale in different ways. Feminist-minded Victorians, rare though they were, hinted that the rumour was an invention of men, a way to reduce a clever, ambitious woman to a monstrous body. Still, the image stuck. In cheap woodcuts, Anne's hands were often drawn hidden beneath sleeves, as though artists feared to show them. In lurid novels, suitors recoiled when they caught sight of her hand. Stage plays made use of the detail too, with actresses wriggling their fingers in sly emphasis, hinting at the damning digit that doomed a queen. You find yourself staring at your own hands. In the half-dream, your fingers look longer than usual, pale in the lamplight. For a heartbeat, you wonder if an extra one stirs at the edge, spectral, flickering in and out of view. Perhaps that is how the story worked. Once the suggestion was planted, people began to see it everywhere. A phantom finger reaching from rumour into reality. In the Victorian press, scientists weighed in. Articles appeared in journals about hereditary deformities, about polydactyly, about how extra digits were not uncommon and might run in families. Some even speculated that if Anne had borne a son, he too might have been marked. In such speculation we glimpse the anxieties of the age, the fear of degeneration, of bloodlines tainted, of monstrous births. Anne's rumoured sixth finger became a metaphor for more than herself. It was a warning about queens, about women, about the instability of the body politic. And yet, behind the fascination, there lingers silence. No contemporary portrait shows such a deformity. No ambassador, no chronicler close to her mentions it. Even her executioner, who described her elegance and calm, said nothing of a strange hand. It seems likely that the finger was never there at all. The rumour was a weapon, born of malice, revived by Victorian hunger for sensation. But falsehoods, once launched, rarely die. They multiply, mutate, return again and again like a ghost limb. You hear the whisper of turning pages. Another book lies open, a Victorian penny pamphlet crudely printed. Its illustration shows Anne holding her hand aloft, a glaring sixth finger protruding. The text warns young women against vanity, ambition, and lust, claiming that Anne's deformity was God's brand of shame. You realise that even centuries later, she was still being punished, not only by death, but by story. The gas lamps sputter. Shadows leap across the library walls. For a moment you almost see her there. Anne herself standing among the shelves, her right hand raised, hidden by a velvet sleeve. You strain to see. Does she bare her hand, revealing the truth? Or does she keep it concealed, letting the rumour live on, stronger in secrecy than in proof? The vision blurs and the lamps go out. You're left in darkness, with only the echo of a phantom digit brushing against your palm. Perhaps the sixth finger never existed. But in the Victorian mind it returned, again and again, until it became as real as the woman herself. And in that dream world of history, sometimes the rumour matters more than the flesh. The air shifts again, the dusty library dissolves, and now you are seated beside a flickering hearth. It is still the 19th century, but no longer among the scholars and antiquarians who combed dusty archives for scraps of Anne's story. Instead, you're in the parlour of a novelist. The fire glows, a pen scratches on paper, and a woman bends over her desk. She's not recording facts, but weaving dreams, romances, tragedies, melodramas in which Anne Boleyn lives again, not as the cold figure of history, but as a heroine of feeling. The Victorians adored such tales. They had inherited Shakespeare and the grand sweep of history, but they also longed for emotion, for the kind of story that could move a reader to tears beside the fire. And Anne was perfect for them. She was beautiful, doomed, betrayed. an English queen whose very death seemed scripted for drama. To them she was less a politician than a romantic icon, a woman caught in the merciless gears of love and ambition. You lean closer as the novelist writes. In her tale, Anne is not the ambitious schemer of Tudor propaganda, but a gentle maiden, seduced by a powerful king. At first she resists. Her heart belongs to another, perhaps a noble youth or a secret poet. Yet the king insists, and the weight of his passion, combined with the glitter of the crown, overwhelms her. She does not seek power, it seeks her. Already you can sense the shaping of myth. Anne as tragic victim, swept along by forces she cannot resist. In these romantic retellings, Henry is the true villain. He appears as a dark, brooding tyrant, his love more dangerous than hatred. He woos with honeyed words, but behind his eyes lies cruelty. Readers thrilled at the thought, what if love itself could become lethal? What if the crown were poisoned from the start? In the novels, Anne suffers not only from Henry's wrath, but from the poisonous whispers of the court, jealous rivals, scheming ministers, and false friends who betray her innocence. You notice how different this is from the historical Anne, who was clever, ambitious, and shrewd in court politics. The Victorians, uncomfortable with such female agency, often stripped her of it. They preferred to see her as pure-hearted, as a victim of fate, as someone undone by love rather than by her own calculations. In their telling, Anne becomes a mirror of the Victorian ideal, virtuous, delicate, wronged by men and society. A novelist lifts her pen, dips it in ink and continues. She writes of Anne's final days in the Tower, but not with the stark simplicity of eyewitnesses. Instead, she adorns them with lush detail. The moonlight streaming through her barred window, the tear-stained letters written by candlelight, the whispered prayers that break into sobs. She imagines Anne clutching a miniature portrait of her daughter Elizabeth, weeping not for her own death, but for the future of the child she will never raise. In truth, Elizabeth was a toddler, and no miniature like that has survived. Yet in the world of romantic novels, such details matter more than accuracy. They are symbols designed to pierce the reader's heart. You can almost hear the sobs of those Victorian readers, turning pages by lamplight. For them, Anne's story was not just history, it was an emotional performance. Her fall became a cautionary tale about love, power, and the cruelty of men. Some novels painted her as saintly, others as naive, but nearly all made her tragic. Even the supposed deformity of her sixth finger was softened. In fiction, it might appear as a symbol of her fragile humanity, something she wept over in private while still enchanting the world with her beauty. It is strange, you think, how the Victorians found in Anne not the ruthless game player of politics, but the heroine of a love story. Yet perhaps it was inevitable. They lived in an age where women's power was still tightly constrained, and so they reshaped Anne into someone who fit their narrative. In doing so, they robbed her of some agency but gave her new life in another form. The fire in the hearth crackles, and the novelist sets aside her pen. She sighs, gazes out the window, and you hear her murmur to herself. For her, Anne is not just a queen long dead. She is an eternal figure, a woman wronged by destiny, whose story echoes the sorrows of every woman betrayed by love. Perhaps that was the secret of Anne's survival in literature. She became a vessel for feelings that readers themselves carried. In the romantic novels, Anne's execution is almost always the climax, yet it is rarely depicted with gore or political detail. Instead, it is softened, wrapped in melancholy beauty. She steps onto the scaffold in white, like a bride. The crowd falls silent. Her final speech is described with poetic flourish, words of forgiveness and courage that make readers weep. The axe falls, but not brutally. Instead, it is a symbolic end, almost gentle, as though her soul ascends in light. You realise that in these stories Anne never truly dies. She becomes eternal, preserved in the amber of fiction. Her fate may be cruel, but her memory glows with nobility. That was what the Victorians wanted, not a messy queen caught in politics, but a timeless heroine of romance. The parlour fades, the fire dwindles to embers. You're left with the echo of those novels, their prose heavy with sentiment, their pages yellow with time, and you wonder, was this version of Anne any truer than the others? Or was it simply another mask, another dream that history wears when it wants to comfort itself with beauty instead of truth? The ink on the page dries. Somewhere a reader closes a book and wipes away a tear. In their mind, Anne Boleyn lives, not as she was, but as they needed her to be. The candlelight dims, and suddenly the rustle of Victorian pages is replaced by the hum of a film projector. The air is filled with the smell of warm celluloid, the flicker of black and white frames dancing across the screen. We have moved from the drawing rooms of the 19th century to the cinemas of the 20th. Now Anne Boleyn lives not in novels, but in moving images, her tragedy reframed for the silver screen. At first she appeared in the silent era, where actresses with wide, expressive eyes draped themselves in Tudor gowns. Their performances were dramatic pantomimes, designed not to inform but to evoke. You see Anne reaching for Henry, shrinking from the axe, clutching her daughter in a fantasy sequence that never happened. The silence made her mythic, like a figure from legend. Audiences did not care for accuracy. They came for spectacle, for the haunting image of a queen wronged and destroyed. As decades passed, Anne grew louder. By the mid-20th century, Hollywood discovered her. Costumes became sumptuous, colours dazzling, and her character began to shift once more. Sometimes she was seductress, ambitious, calculating, luring Henry with her dark eyes and sharp wit. Other times she was a victim, caught in the net of his tyranny. Rarely was she balanced between the two. The camera, like the chroniclers of old, demanded clarity. Heroine or villain, angel or siren. The 1933 film The Private Life of Henry VIII gave one of the earliest cinematic Annes. She was fleeting, almost a shadow before the story moved on to Henry's other wives. But even in brief scenes her elegance shone. Later films gave her more voice. In the 1960s, Geneviève Bujold's performance in Anne of the Thousand Days gave audiences a fiery queen, proud and intelligent. Her Anne sparred with Henry, matching his rage with her own defiance. She was no helpless maiden, but a woman who fought for her place, her daughter, and her dignity. When the axe fell, viewers wept not only for her, but for the loss of her courage. You can almost hear the cinema audience gasping as Bujold's Anne declares, "Elizabeth shall be a greater queen than any king of yours." It was not a line Anne ever spoke, but it captured a truth audiences wanted, that Anne's bloodline justified her struggle, that her suffering was redeemed in Elizabeth's glory. It was history reshaped into drama, and the drama was irresistible. Hollywood also delighted in Anne as a seductress. The Tudor court was fertile ground for passion, betrayal and intrigue, and directors knew that sex and scandal sold tickets. In some versions, Anne became a temptress who toyed with Henry's desire, driving him to madness. Her downfall then seemed like a punishment for ambition, a moral lesson wrapped in velvet. Audiences, especially in the conservative mid-century years, often accepted this reading. A woman too hungry for power must fall, But as times changed, so did Anne. By the early 21st century, with series like The Tudors, she was reborn again, this time as both lover and strategist. Natalie Dormer's Anne was sensual, intelligent and complex, seductive yet vulnerable, calculating yet tragically human. Her story unfolded across seasons, allowing for nuance that earlier films could not provide. Audiences could finally see her as a whole person, not just a symbol. She plotted, she loved, she erred, she endured, and when her death came, it felt not like melodrama but like the cruel logic of history. Watching these portrayals, you sense how Anne's image has always bent to the needs of the age. In the moralizing 1930s, she was a lesson. In the feminist-influenced 1960s, she was proud and defiant. In the modern, more psychologically attuned era, she is layered, ambiguous, caught between love and ambition. Each generation remakes her, polishing a new mask for the same ancient face. You imagine sitting in a theatre as the final scene plays. The scaffold rises, the music swells. Anne ascends the wooden steps dressed in white or black, depending on the director's taste. She looks calm, or terrified, or proud, or resigned. The camera lingers. The audience holds its breath. And then, as the blade falls, or the screen fades to black, there is a hush. For a moment, the entire room shares her silence. In that silence lies the power of Hollywood Anne. She's not a dusty relic of history, but a living performance, renewed every time the reel begins to spin. Millions who never opened a history book know her story through these films. For them, Anne Boleyn is Geneviève Bujold, or Natalie Dormer, or another actress yet to come. The real Anne, the woman who lived and died in the 16th century, is lost behind layers of costume and script. Yet perhaps that too is a kind of immortality. The projector whirs to a stop. The screen fades to white. You're left with the afterglow of a face that has been played by dozens of women across nearly a century of film. She smiles, she weeps, she defies, she seduces. And in every portrayal she lives again, shaped by the desires of storytellers and the imaginations of audiences. You lean back, drowsy, hearing the echo of lines that Anne never spoke but that somehow belong to her now. Hollywood has given her not one voice, but many. And as long as cameras roll, Anne Boleyn will never be silent. The night deepens, and the old projector's hum fades into the quiet rustle of library pages. Now we're not in a theatre, but in a study. Lamplight glows on the polished wood of a scholar's desk, where piles of thick books stand like fortresses. For centuries, Anne Boleyn had been the plaything of playwrights, propagandists and filmmakers. Yet in the modern age, voices began to rise in her defence. They were historians, biographers, feminists and curious readers who asked a daring question. What if Anne Boleyn had been wronged not only by Henry VIII, but also by history itself? For generations she had been trapped in caricature, the witch, the seductress, the power-hungry upstart who dared to topple a queen, or else she was painted as a doomed saint, a martyr for Protestant faith. Both images were neat, convenient, and both reduced her to an idea rather than a woman. Modern defenders set out to restore her humanity, peeling away centuries of rumour to glimpse the living Anne beneath. One of the earliest and most influential was historian Eric Ives, whose monumental biography, The Life and Death of Anne Boleyn, reshaped how readers saw her. Ives argued that Anne was not merely a pawn or temptress, but a woman of education, wit, and conviction. She had opinions about religion, about art, about politics. She was neither the scheming seductress of Catholic propaganda nor the helpless victim of romantic fiction. She was complicated, she was intelligent, she was real. Other scholars followed, challenging myths one by one. The sixth finger, a cruel invention of later centuries, the countless lovers, fabrications from men eager to justify her destruction. The witchcraft, absurdity born of fear. Bit by bit, Anne's reputation was rebuilt, not as perfect, but as plausible. A woman of ambition, yes, but also of charm, laughter, and depth. Feminist historians saw in Anne something more, a case study in how patriarchal societies punish women who rise too high. Anne, they argued, had been crushed not because she failed, but because she succeeded too well. She caught Henry's heart, she shifted policy, she dared to influence decisions at court. Such boldness in a man would have been admired. In a woman, it was intolerable. When she could no longer provide a son, she became dispensable. Her trial was not justice but theatre, her execution not necessity but convenience. Modern defenders also highlight her role in the larger sweep of history. Without Anne, the Reformation in England might have unfolded differently. Without her, Elizabeth might never have been born. Without Elizabeth, the story of Britain, and even of the world, would look entirely other. In this sense, Anne's life, however brief, became the fulcrum on which centuries turned. To dismiss her as a mere temptress is to ignore the immensity of her influence. Yet defenders do not paint her as flawless. They remind us she could be sharp-tongued, prideful, even reckless. She played the courtly game as well as any, and she understood the stakes. She was not innocent in the sense of being naive, but she was guilty only of being human, something that her enemies denied her. By giving her back her humanity, modern scholars allow us to see her not as an icon, but as a woman caught in extraordinary circumstances. Popular writers, too, have joined the defence. Novels like Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall and Philippa Gregory's The Other Boleyn Girl, though controversial in accuracy, reopened debates about her character, forcing readers to think critically about the Anne they thought they knew. Television shows and documentaries now often feature historians speaking in her favour, correcting misconceptions for millions of viewers. Even in social media, communities of Anne defenders flourish, sharing archival sources, debunking myths, and celebrating her as more than just a doomed queen. There is also a sense of kinship. Modern women, navigating careers and ambition, see something of themselves in Anne's struggle. She was punished for her wit, her charm, her boldness, qualities that today are celebrated but still sometimes feared in women. To defend Anne is not only to defend history's accuracy, but also to protest the injustice of silencing female voices. As you picture this movement, you see a circle of readers by candlelight, whispering over letters and chronicles. They take the fragments, the love letters from Henry, the diplomatic reports, the testimonies at her trial, and they read between the lines. They find not a villain nor a saint, but a woman of flesh and spirit. They breathe life back into her story. The effect of these modern defenders is profound. Where once Anne's name conjured scandal, now it inspires sympathy, even admiration. She has become a symbol of resilience, of intelligence crushed too soon, of a woman who mattered more than her enemies ever intended. Her voice, muted in life, echoes more strongly with every retelling. And so, as the lamplight glows and the library hush deepens, you realise that Anne Boleyn is no longer just the property of Henry's court, or of Tudor propaganda, or of Hollywood scripts. She belongs to us, in the present, as a figure of enduring fascination. The defenders have not freed her entirely. No one can undo the axe. but they have rescued her from the silence that followed. In their words, she walks again, not as a ghost in the tower, but as a woman whose story still matters. The pages close, the lamplight flickers. You're left with the quiet conviction that perhaps Anne's greatest triumph did not come in life, nor even in Elizabeth's reign, but here, in the modern world, where her defenders refuse to let her be forgotten or misunderstood ever again. The projector flickers again, and suddenly you are no longer in a library nor a Tudor court. You're in modern London, where the past has been packaged, priced, and placed neatly into brochures. The cobbled streets are crowded with buses painted crimson, their roofs open to the grey sky. Guides lift microphones and declare in bright voices, "And here, ladies and gentlemen, is the Tower of London, where the tragic Queen Anne Boleyn met her fate." Tourists lean forward, cameras raised, as the centuries collapse into a single photo opportunity. Anne Boleyn, once a living woman, now exists as both memory and merchandise. She has become a tourist queen. Her story is retold daily in gift shops, walking tours, and glossy museum panels. Her face, stern and enigmatic in portraits, appears from postcards, keychains, even mugs. The irony is sharp. Once condemned as a traitor, she is now sold as a national icon. Step through the Tower of London and you will find her story staged again and again. Actors in Tudor garb whisper Anne's last words to crowds of schoolchildren. Visitors shuffle into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where a small brass plate marks her burial place. Some bow their heads, others snap selfies. Guides speak of her bravery, her tragic end, and the ghost that still paces the green. At night tours, the tale grows darker. Flickering lanterns, whispers of headless spectres, and the audience gasping as if Anne herself were still pleading for mercy. Elsewhere in the city, her presence lingers. At Hampton Court Palace, where Henry and Anne once walked, visitors wander through grand halls with audio guides that replay their courtship, their quarrels, their collapse. "Imagine," says the voice in your ear, "Anne standing here, triumphant, believing her future was secure." Gift shops nearby sell Anne Boleyn bookmarks and necklaces modelled on her famous Pearl B pendant. For a price, you can carry a piece of her with you. The tourism industry thrives on contrasts, romance and horror, glamour and blood. Anne's story fits perfectly. She was the dazzling queen who lost her head. She's remembered as both heroine and victim, her life cut short in a way that feels like theatre. For tourists, she is both history lesson and entertainment. They may know little of Tudor politics, but they know this much. Anne Boleyn was beautiful, doomed, and unforgettable. Walking tours across London often advertise her name. Posters promise the dark secrets of the Tudors, or the ghost of Anne Boleyn. Guides lead groups into alleyways where the scent of street food mingles with stories of execution. They dramatise her final moments, lowering their voices for effect. With a single stroke, the Queen was gone. Gasps ripple through the group, though every one of them already knew how the story ends. That is the appeal. Anne's tragedy has become ritual, retold endlessly for audiences hungry for drama. And yet, beneath the commercial gloss, something deeper stirs. Visitors often report feeling a strange solemnity at her memorial stone in the Tower Chapel. Some leave flowers, some whisper prayers. Even among the chatter and souvenir bags there is reverence. Perhaps because Anne's story touches something universal, the fear of injustice, the fragility of power, the cruelty of fate. Tourism may commodify her, but it also keeps her memory alive. Without these retellings, her grave might lie forgotten, her story fading into dusty chronicles. Instead, she is renewed each day by those who come to see her, to hear her, to feel the shiver of standing where she stood. Beyond London, her name still sells. Country houses associated with the Boleyn family advertise her connection. Historians lecture to packed halls. Television crews retrace her footsteps. Even abroad, Anne is invoked as shorthand for Tudor intrigue. Her beheading is among the most famous in history, recognisable to millions who could not name another queen. Of course, there is irony in this afterlife. In her lifetime, Anne was despised by many, feared by others, and destroyed by the king who once adored her. Now she is beloved, so much so that people pay to stand in the shadow of her tragedy. The axe that silenced her has become the very object that ensures her eternal fame. As you picture this, you see a family stepping out of a London gift shop clutching a bag. Inside are refrigerator magnets bearing Anne's portrait, a paperback biography, and perhaps a charm shaped like her famous necklace. To them, she's part of their holiday, a story to tell friends back home. They will not think of her as a political player in the Reformation, but as the tragic queen whose ghost still walks the tower. That is the power of tourism. It simplifies, it packages, and it spreads. Yet Anne's modern defenders, those scholars in the quiet libraries, sometimes cringe at this spectacle. They argue that tourist Anne, the ghost, the victim, the face on a mug, risks burying the real woman once more. But perhaps there is room for both. The myths lure people in, the souvenirs send them home smiling, and sometimes curiosity grows. A visitor who first buys a trinket may later open a book, eager to know more than the simplified tale. In this way, even the commercial Anne leads back to the historical one. The tower bells toll in your imagination. Crowds shuffle toward the exit, tour guides close their umbrellas, and the shops roll down their shutters. The day is over, but Anne's story has been told again, perhaps 1,000 times. Tomorrow it will be told again, and the day after that. And as long as people keep walking those cobblestones, she will never vanish. So Anne Boleyn, once condemned to silence beneath the cold stone of a chapel, has become immortal in the most unlikely way. She's kept alive not just by scholars, but by tourists, by the very crowds who laugh, gasp, and shop she's remembered. And whether in solemn reflection or in playful souvenirs, she remains present in the city that once watched her die. The buses move on, the tourists drift into the night, and London lights shimmer on the Thames. Anne's face still gazes from the postcards in the shop window, her eyes mysterious, her story unfinished. The tourist queen waits for tomorrow's visitors, ready to live again through every retelling. The library projector hums one last time, casting a softer light, as though it too is winding down for the evening. You sit surrounded by the echoes of centuries, your eyelids heavy, yet your mind still restless with images of Anne Boleyn. The historian's voice, sometimes calm, sometimes wry, sometimes mournful, returns for this final chapter. It no longer lectures, but almost whispers, as if confiding something just to you. Anne Boleyn is not finished. She has never been finished. Each time we try to end her story, at the scaffold, at the grave, at the memorial plate in the Tower Chapel, something pulls us forward again. She reappears in novels, in films, in endless debates, in the faces of tourists who press their noses against glass to see a surviving lock of her hair or a prayer book she once held. She reappears in the candlelight of ghost tours, in the lines of poetry, in the stern but haunting portraits hung on gallery walls. Why does she linger? Perhaps because Anne's tale is a paradox. She's at once triumphant and tragic, loved and hated, remembered and erased. We cannot pin her down. To some, she was a villain who lured Henry into disaster. To others, she was a proto-feminist, standing against a world that sought to silence her. To still others, she's only a victim, a figure of pity. Each retelling reshapes her, yet none is final. The real Anne remains just out of reach, shimmering like a figure seen through glass darkened by centuries. Think of how her story has shifted over time. In Tudor chronicles she was condemned, her faults magnified. In later centuries, romantic writers painted her as the doomed beauty, a candle snuffed out too soon. In the 20th century, dramatists made her witty, sharp, almost modern, a heroine too clever for her age. And in our time, she is all of these at once: victim, survivor, icon, ghost, and celebrity. She is flexible, malleable, an eternal subject for whoever needs her. Even her death did not define her alone, for in dying she helped shape an entire nation. The break with Rome, the rise of Protestant England, the crown passing to her daughter Elizabeth, Anne's life and death echo through every English history lesson, whether acknowledged or not. She was not just a queen who fell. She was a hinge upon which history turned. And so, she cannot be allowed to rest. We tell her story again because in some strange way, it is also the story of England, of power, of the risks that come with ambition and desire. There is also something deeply human about her fate that transcends politics. Everyone knows on some level what it means to be misunderstood, to be envied, to fall from grace. Her story magnifies those feelings into something vast, tragic, unforgettable. When she walks through our imagination, she walks carrying not only her crown and her downfall, but the burdens of all who have ever been betrayed by fortune. Listen closely. You can almost hear the scratching of quills across time. Historians still argue late into the night about her guilt or innocence, her motives, her personality. Was she calculating, or merely caught in forces larger than herself? Was she a reformer, or simply a pawn in Henry's passion? The questions never end, and perhaps that is the secret. Anne is endlessly unfinished because we need her to be. She gives us something to debate, to dramatize, to feel. She will never be solved, and so she will never fade. Imagine her now, not in the tower, not in a palace, but drifting through the centuries like a figure on stage. Each era hands her a new costume, a new script, a new spotlight. In one age she is tragic heroine, in another scheming enchantress, in another still feminist symbol. The stage changes, the audience changes, but Anne remains at the centre, her presence magnetic. Even as you drift towards sleep, you can sense her there, both real and unreal, history and myth at once. And so, when the lights of the projector finally dim, when the library grows quiet, Anne does not vanish. She waits. She always waits. In the morning, another student will pull another book, another tourist will step into the tower, another writer will begin another page. The story begins again, as it always does. That is why she is endless. The historian's voice fades to a murmur, softer than turning pages. Anne Boleyn is not a ghost to be laid to rest, nor a queen to be forgotten. She is a story, and stories do not die. Your eyes close at last. The figures of Tudor London dissolve into the soft fabric of dream. Yet even here, in the drifting haze of sleep, Anne lingers. She does not haunt you with terror, but with presence, the quiet insistence that her tale is still unfinished, still waiting, still alive, and tomorrow, somewhere, someone will tell it again.